Welcome, everyone. It's good to have you here for our TAC meeting. There's a great deal to cover today. I think you've all had an opportunity to review the materials that the working groups have produced, and as you would therefore know, there's a great deal for us to cover. As always, we're focused on the actionable recommendations, and we'll look for those as we go through and then perhaps discuss some of those as we get to the end. I do have a couple of welcomes for us today and otherwise notes. First of all, I'd like to note that Marty Cooper is not with us, and that is because he is on his way to Italy to receive the Marconi Prize, which is a very significant form of recognition. It's nice to have a member of our body receiving such recognition. I'd also like to recognize a couple of our new members. Teresa Hennessy has joined us from Comcast, replacing Charlotte Fields, who's been a stalwart member of the group and very much a member of the community, for telecommunications community, for a long time. But she is retiring, and those of you who were not aware of that, this is an opportunity for you to wish Charlotte well. Please do so. Also have a change in representation for the NCTA today, and I'm going to have to...
Actually, NCTA is replacing Opatsco, but they've merged with it.
Walter's whispering in my ear so that I get this correct. And Walter?
The NCTA has merged with Opatsco, which we had a previous representation on, and today Lynn Merrill will be representing NCTA.
So Lynn, raise your hand. There he is. Enough of us around the table today. It's hard to identify you all. The other person I'd like to recognize is John Barnhill, who is representing Genban, and he's replacing Charles Vogt. So welcome to John. And where's John? There you are. Okay. Good. And I think that is the recognition of the new members of our body, and to introduce yourselves to not only the new members, but also to those who are televiewing for this session. I'd ask that you identify yourself around the table, and we'll start with Walter since he's busy doing something else.
I'm actually attending to the conference bridge.
Okay, thanks.
Not idle. Walter Johnson from the Office of Engineering and Technology, and assistant to Dennis Roberson in his affairs.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. We got to pass around. Dick Green, Liberty Global.
Dale Hatfield, University of Colorado.
Kevin Sparks, Alcatel-Lucent.
Paul Steinberg with Motorola Solutions.
It's wireless. Jack Waters, Level 3 Communications.
John Chapin, DARPA.
David Tenenhouse, Microsoft.
Shahid Ahmed, Accenture.
Mark Bayless, Visual Inc.
David Clark, MIT.
Jeff Mendenhall, Harris Broadcast.
Greg Lappin, ARRL.
Jesse Russell, Inc. Networks.
Matt Chan, Verizon.
Len Claudy, National Association of Broadcasters.
Mark Richer, Advanced Television Systems Committee.
Brian Mark Walter, CEA.
Brian Fonts, National Emergency Number Association.
Adam Drobot, Open Tech Works.
Romani Pandurangan, Exo Communications.
Teresa Hennessy, Comcast.
Brian Daly, AT&T.
Lynn Merrill, NTCA.
Pierre DeFries, Silicon Flatiron Center.
Milo Medine from Google.
Mark Bregman from Newstar.
Peter Bloom from General Atlantic.
Bob Pavlak, Office of Engineering and Technology.
Marvin Serbu, Carnegie Mellon University.
Michael Ha, FCC.
Jack Nishelski from Qualcomm.
Kevin Kahn, Intel.
Naomi Bergman, Bright House.
Joe Wetzel, Earthlink.
John Barnhill from Genband.
Russell Jurek with Cisco.
Henning Schultz-Swinney, FCC.
Julie Knapp, FCC OET.
And I'd like to ask, is anybody on the bridge? I'll take that as a no.
That the bridge isn't working.
That's what I'm afraid of.
Everybody's here.
There are, in fact, multiple options.
I know there are people who want to get on the bridge, so we'll start with the first presentation, then I'll look. Yes. Okay, I'll take care of that in a second.
Yeah.
She said she'll be on in a sec. I just got a jabber from her.
Okay.
She'll be on in a sec.
Well, I will still check that the bridge is working.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, with the formalities somewhat out of the way, I would like to recognize our sponsor and chairwoman. Those of you who were in the audience would not know this, but we were slightly delayed with the enjoyable opportunity to spend a little bit of time with the chairwoman, and we appreciate Chairwoman Clyburn's support for this organization, and we appreciate having David Valdez, who is here, who's back here, who is representing her for this meeting. So the chairman's office is in fact with us and watching and looking for the opportunities to move forward on the recommendations, actionable recommendations, as Tom always pointed out to us, that is our goal out of these meetings. I'd like to jump very quickly into our working group reviews. We have a number of them that for those of you not familiar, that have been proceeding, 5 in fact, that have been proceeding rigorously through the year and in particular through the last quarter. So we'll look forward to the reports from each of those. And I think we have the agenda that can be put on the screen. And there have been several asking the order. Now you know the order. And that doesn't help Brian too much, although I did give him the pre-warning. But Brian Markwalter and Spectrum Frontiers, the farthest outreaching working group that we have, will give us a view of the future.
The ritual passing.
Furthest out.
And
no, don't.
We won't do the passing. I'll walk it around to him. There was a previous chair, for those of you not aware, who threw the clicker across the room and was greatly berated for his actions. So.
And rightly so.
So we'll avoid that for the future. And Brian, you're on.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis. Let's see how we're doing here. All right, there we go. Good afternoon. I'm Brian Markwalter. I want to start out by thanking the FCC staff who have helped with the Spectrum Frontiers working group, Michael Ha and John Leibovitz. So this has been an educational exercise for us because we're looking at much higher frequencies than most of us have had to deal with in our daily lives. So it's been educational, and the staff's been super helpful in helping us understand the rules as they go up into regions that we're not very familiar with. Here's our charter in this slide here. The way we look at it is we wanted to look higher in frequencies at bands that may be of new or further commercialization use. And so that's the way we've thought about things, particularly as technology advances and there are new market forces in play that may make new allocations accessible to us. And as I mentioned, so we've been looking at, I'd say 28 gigahertz and up has been our region of interest. We have I think Dennis's group has looked more at efficiency gains, particularly in bands that are actively used now. So we've focused our efforts on new bands. So if we just do an overview of kind of what's transpired at the last meeting, we gave a little picture of some of the higher frequency bands and looked at the key allocations in millimeter wave. In particular, so millimeter wave is a pretty wide area, 30 to 300 gigahertz by most people's accounting. So this is mostly in the lower end there. And we've talked about some of the broadband activities. That was a setup for a recommendation we're going to make at this meeting. There have been a couple of things that's transpired. In particular, there was a 60 gigahertz report and order that has come out related to the power available for that range. And we didn't note it here. There's also a petition by the IEEE USA group that we've not dealt with directly, but it does kind of play into some of the higher bands. So in this presentation, the way we've grouped our thinking is in the 30 to 40 gigahertz millimeter wave, very low end of millimeter wave, where we will have a specific recommendation. We then treated 95 to 275 gigahertz, that happens to be a break point in the way the rules are written. And then the last chunk we've looked at is what everybody tends to call terahertz communications, so very high range. So diving into 30 to 40 gigahertz, this slide, the background here that shows the allocation is courtesy of a presentation that Samsung has done. I think this is probably publicly available if you search for it, but there are others out there, but it's a pretty good summary of the allocations in this band. So I'd also like to think, Samsung did a presentation for us. Intel gave us some information on their activities in this area and their interest for further commercialization. If I could make just a couple of takeaways from this slide, I think the important points are that there is a mobile allocation here. So if you decode all the colors and whatnot that's on the slide, there are some mobile allocations here, but there aren't really service rules. So we don't see usage for sort of mobile broadband yet. There's maybe a secondary issue that they are not harmonized globally. So that's an area of interest for us, but not our primary focus of discussion. So in terms of current activities, as we've learned, there's no greenfield really. I mean, every band has something going on. It seems it might be passive services, but there's something happening in every band, and there's quite a bit here. So we looked at LMDS in particular. I'll have some more slides following in just a minute. EXO was a great contributor in helping us understand what's going on in LMDS. But in LMDS, there's quite a bit of allocation there. It's 1.3 gigahertz total. There's a nice block of 850 megahertz. These are Part 101 rules that govern use there, and licensees are by basic trading area. The primary application, we'll talk a little bit more about applications in this space for things like LMDS, but by far the primary application is backhaul. And as most of you have read or kept track of LMDS, there have been licenses returned. I'll touch on that a bit more. There's also V-band usage here, which has a mix of fixed satellite and fixed service. So that's not uncommon throughout this low millimeter wave band to have fixed service and fixed satellite. There's an NPRM on V-band that's still active. We've not really dug into that. So looking at LMDS band, so here's a great picture of what specific LMDS looks like. There's an A block that's coded in yellow here, and there are 3 sub-blocks in the A block. So there's A1, A2, and A3. There's a B block in blue, so kind of a B1, B2 that surrounds the A3 band. So you can see there's a nice band that's allocated for LMDS. There is geostationary and non-geostationary services that are mixed in. So we have satellite and terrestrial operations going on here. The LMDS application, I won't read all of this. It's roughly broken out by, I guess you'd say, left column is kind of the good part. right column addresses some of the issues you've read about underutilization. Some of the important parts are that it's primarily a point-to-point application, that the usage has been, I think, fairly robust in urban areas, as you might expect, for backhaul. And where we've seen more licenses turned in has been in rural areas, as correlated with population, as you might expect. I think the greatest usage, we haven't looked at the numbers directly, the greatest usage is in the A1 block. One of the other things that our group tends to look at as we explore these things, and we're getting smart on both the service rules and allocations, is trying to understand what the market forces and technology enablers are. We think of it, I think this is one of Adam has helped us think through this issue of, is there an ecosystem for the components and the products to drive a market in these spaces. And so that's starting to emerge here pretty strongly. The antenna technology is developing quickly. Once we get into this range, and even more so as we go higher and higher, having beam forming, the antenna technology becomes very critical. It's always important, but you now have to do, I'd say, much fancier things in terms of beam forming, and later we'll talk about beam steering. But one of the things that allows is you get this space division multiplexing, so you can get a lot of reuse because these frequencies tend to be highly focused. And one of the things you're doing, of course, is trying to overcome the attenuation that's inherent with them. So you tend to use higher gain antennas with narrower beams, but there's still, from our estimation, a lot of development going on in this area. It looks like the silicon technology, as we'd expect just by the progression over time, is getting faster, so less esoteric components are required to build some of these products here. What is more difficult is when you have to get into some of the odd IC technologies to accomplish the RF. This idea of scalable network architecture, by that we mean this move towards small cell and mixing cell sizes for mobile applications. And in particular, the point we want to make here is technologies that are going to be successful because it's not really, it's not a green field, so there's a lot of infrastructure deployed. And what will be commercially successful will be new technology that can plug into those systems. So as we go to smaller cells, the way backhaul works and the way these systems are designed, you need to kind of plug into that. What's working today is applications for backhaul. The other thing we hear about, one last comment on market application, we do hear a little bit more about just standing up redundant circuits. So in particular, like a Sandy kind of a storm, where a lot of infrastructure is taken out, the need for simply redundant circuits where a company may put in operation a point-to-point link for redundancy. Okay, our recommendations for this band is that the Commission take action, which may include an NOI to evaluate mobile broadband feasibility and adoption of appropriate service rules to encourage further investment in key technologies and promising services. So we believe this is a ripe area to take action on. We do not feel like we should be overly specific about the type of FCC action, which is why we left open. It's not clear that it should be an NOI or something else. There's more to be learned, and so our second recommendation goes to that point. It would probably be helpful to have a workshop of some type. I hate to, seems like we run to workshops a lot, but these are areas we do need to learn more on, and if that's fruitful for the FCC, we'd be happy to support any way we can. A workshop to understand mostly the level of maturity of the technologies available, and any issues we might have in trying to deploy mobile broadband in these ranges. And also to explore a little bit the harmonization issues. I said this was kind of secondary to trying to get an allocation or service rules in place. So it's not globally harmonized. There may be some benefit to that, but I would not say that's our primary focus by any means. And to that last point, we think the Commission can continue a leadership role in the ITU discussions on these bands. We're learning more like day by day. So what we want to understand is, do we need to get something on the agenda for 2015 that could conclude in 2018? There may be activity there, so that's something we can continue dialogue with. I know the FCC's involved, so we're happy to support that. Okay, moving ahead to the next band, and these. So we looked at 95 to 275, and there is a breakpoint in the rules there. We're still learning in this environment. So part of what we're learning is just the physics as you get to these frequencies dictates that beamforming is part of what you have to do. There's high attenuation typically. So the nice part is the antennas are typically very small, and so you can do beamforming with small antennas. What's less clear is how you might do applications that require more agile beam steering. So that's we can do some degree of beam steering, typically for keeping fixed installations pointing at each other. One of the other big benefits, and this also applies even down in lower millimeter waves, the band we previously discussed, there's this notion of altitude sharing. So because links are so highly focused, it's completely conceivable you could do like a pedestrian street level kind of mobile broadband application, and in exactly the same environment have rooftop links operating. And so we see a lot of potential in that kind of spatial diversity. Last point, the component limits and spectral efficiency. Was this just an idea, and Adam brought this to our attention. As you go up to these really high frequencies, don't expect the same kind of proportional bits per hertz, especially when you're getting started. So that it may, on a bits per hertz measure, it may not look as efficient because these bits have to go somewhere when they get out of the radio. So there's, things look slower on sort of a symbol time basis, but it speeds up. So just notionally, it may appear to be like not the most spectrally efficient, but they are new bands, new applications, and if we just think of a way as what means for decongesting other areas, then that's the right way to look at it. And as we know, there's an onward progression in all these bands as the technologies, as we can apply more gates to things, in getting more bits per hertz out of all of them. Looking ahead again, so DARPA, some of you may know they have a project called 100G, where they're exploring essentially an RF backbone application. So they've just done an award in this area, and what they're looking at are military applications. This is an airborne kind of application, but they want to get extremely high, the kind of data rates you'd expect out of a wired link, only to do this airborne. So they've done an initial award. By all appearances, this will be in the 80 to 120 gigahertz range. So the good part is DARPA is moving there, which will probably advance the state of the art. On the other hand, it is DARPA, and it does not necessarily mean we're super close to commercialization. So as a result, we're continuing to do more learning in this area. We are slated to have a briefing from Dr. Ridgway, who's the program manager for that DARPA 100G, plus another expert in that area who just has a lot of historical work with these very high-speed networks, RF networks. some of the stuff we're going to look at, or we're aware of. The IEEE USA did a petition that has to do with service rules and development above 95 gigahertz. We're aware of that, but we're just at this point it's just we monitor. So it's something we have discussed, but we're still learning, I guess is the best way to put it. So what we do want to look at for December is trying to get a better handle on what expected applications there are in this band and what kind of commercialization timeline we might have. We didn't dwell on it here. There's 70, 80, 90 gigahertz rules and applications. There's a lot going on with radar. But once you cross over to 95 and up, it's less clear the commercial applications, at least to me. All right, moving ahead to the last band we looked at, the terahertz. So when we dug in this area, there are other kind of case examples that seem to be considered for market applications. So one is small cell, and the first two, you can think of as scratched off the list, so to speak. So when we talk to people who are working in terahertz communications, they thought, well, could this be applied to small cell? And the idea would be this sort of tens of meters, maybe a pedestrian, definitely an urban kind of environment. One of the things that truly is magic at this point would be some idea of tracking user equipment, actually pointing a beam at a cell phone, these kind of frequencies. So nobody knows how to do that. When we talked to one of the experts, I'll mention in just a minute, at this point they're just trying to point two antennas at each other and move bits. It seems to me that, so we're quite a ways away from small cell application. So that one gets maybe taken off the list as just not quite ready. Wireless kiosk seems like a fascinating application. The idea here is you could walk up like with a cell phone or something, or some portable device, a tablet, and you could do a very high data rate download. Let's say you go to a kiosk, you load a movie and get on your plane. So that's probably both doable in some senses. The problem is it's pretty well served by existing RF technology. There's things that go very fast at short distances, so that doesn't appear to be a great short-term winner. Now, the wireless data center is the one that the IEEE Terahertz now study group has focused on, and the idea is to do links inside a data center. So if you think of racks of equipment inside a building, where you have a kind of an agile wireless cabling system. And so these will be a number of point-to-point links using terahertz frequencies. So we did have a briefing from Dr. Kerner, who chairs what was the terahertz interest group in 802.15. It's now a study group, so in between the time he briefed us and I guess it was at their meeting in July, they became a study group. So now they are moving one step closer to developing a standard in this area. So part of what they're going to have to balance, or what we'll have to look at, is the cost of components to do this. There's always is it better to do something here, or is there another band that's more cost effective to get the same kind of data rates? And I think that's what they'll be facing in the short term. The antenna technology, there's work to be done yet there. And also there's something I'll address in just a second, interference to passive services. It's not clear how big an issue that is, but we're scratching our heads a little bit on it. Anyway, for the next step, the study group will aim at this wireless data center concept, and here's the URL for their homepage if you want to. There's quite a bit of material developed by that interest group over the past few years. So if you look at the ITU radio regulations, there's a footnote 5.565, and this is it verbatim, so I'll let you read it. But the chart there, the spectrum chart, shows you in blue what's marked as passive services, and the users are asked to protect the passive services. So at first blush, let me just move ahead. At first blush, it appears, well, there's a problem because there's very large chunks of these bands that are protected for passive services. It's not clear that in the long run that's a big problem for two reasons. One, if when we talk to Dr. Kerner about their application, well, they just assume they're going to coexist because they're in a building. It's fairly low power. They just don't see coexistence as a problem. So the ITU footnote is not an issue for them. And I think, furthermore, it's not clear as commercial applications become better defined that you can't get some relief. Maybe there are some bands that are negotiable here, and that's part of what we're still trying to learn. Michael's been bringing us more information lately. So we're trying to get a better understanding on that. So as I mentioned, IEEE, they're basically said we're going on a coexistence path. There's big blocks available, and we think it's not going to be an issue to coexist with these passive services. Then looking ahead, Dennis, to what we might be doing for December. So we assume we're available to support any ongoing discussion or work towards development of mobile broadband in the 30 to 40 gigahertz range. We have some more learning to do, especially the 95 to 275, and understanding the applications that might make sense there and what kind of commercial timeline. And then lastly, I think we want to get our head around the passive services, maybe develop better dialogue with the users of the passive users and those who need spectrum for earth sciences, earth observation, and whatnot. So I think that's it.
Obviously, a very, very good presentation of the results of your work, Brian. So we do thank you and thank the working group for your efforts. Now it's the opportunity for the TAC to provide your inputs or questions about the work and at the very frontier of wireless. Comments, questions, thoughts? Quiet bunch today.
I have a general question that I would find as a non-RF expert helpful. You mentioned for each band kind of the physical limits implication. Is there a agreed upon definitions what are reasonable ranges, power limits for both safety and other and visibility concerns?
Yeah, that's a. Yeah. So we've touched on.
Sorry to tread into
No. So we've touched on a couple of those. So one issue that we have not, I think, drilled all the way down on is, does anything special need to be done? Because we're now going to be talking about highly pointable, very narrow beam width antennas, and we've touched on it, but I don't think we've really concluded anything there. Of course, this is a huge range we're talking about here. Another area that is of interest, this is one of those, boy, if I had more time, I'd like to understand. And we've looked at some charts related to especially propagation. There's oxygen absorption bands in here. There's a lot of sort of physics things that are going on, and I don't think we have a great handle on why. What might be great bands for doing some things, and one thing that personally I'd like to understand better are some of the things that are wanted for passive services or earth observation, is that going to somehow align for physics reasons with areas we also want to use for communications reasons? I don't think I answered your question. There's areas we're still trying to understand, but I think do the rules align with how these devices might be deployed probably needs a little bit more study.
Paul. Yes, and I should point out Paul's doing the right thing. Our protocol is put your tent card up if you have a question or comment.
Just kind of an offshoot here. Have you guys been thinking at all, Brian, about what kinds of spectrum access policies make sense? Dynamic access or dedicated spectrum for certain purposes, that sort of thing, or is it too early?
I'd say too early. which is why our recommendation is pretty broad. We're not sure what path, and I don't know if you mean like sort of channel access kind of rules or policy rules. I think we're open. It's clear there's a lot going on in these bands, and so we wanted to give the FCC a lot of flexibility in how they might consider adding additional services here.
All right, seeing no other cards up, we will come back to the recommendations that have been made at the end and have a chance as a TAC to determine what our general perspectives are on the recommendations that have been made. Now a special pleasure to have Lynn Cloudy present the results of the Spectrum Receiver Working Group, and those of you who are smiling should, because I am relinquishing that role with great pleasure to Lynn today.
Great reluctance.
No, great pleasure. Lynn, please.
Thank you, Dennis. Dennis Roberson, of course, is the head of this working group, so I'm representing him, and so he can pursue his higher function in this meeting. So if there is shock and dismay at anything I say, please direct your reactions to Dennis. Think Dennis. If we could have the slides up. Great. This is the makeup of our group, which covers a very wide range of interests of both spectrum users and spectrum policy think tank type of people and academics. We have the privilege of being guided by Julie Knapp from the FCC and his able lieutenants, Bob Pavlak and Matthew Hussey. So up front, we would like to thank them for their continued interest and for putting up with all of us, and especially for their wisdom and advice. This is our mission. We, as a group, elevated the conversation around the concept of interference limits policy and have been pursuing the details and the ramifications of implementing such a policy in this current period. The working group is also looking at system challenges of attempting to improve spectrum efficiency and has some recommendations for next steps in several related areas. So these are the study areas that we're reporting on today. Specifics about implementing interference limits policy, including the use of multi-stakeholder groups. We have a recommendation there. We have a proposal for a radio service standards knowledge base, which is a way for spectrum users to find current information about their neighbors that use spectrum near to them. The group is also looking at emerging technologies that would facilitate interference rejection in receivers. And finally, issues that revolve around resolving interference situations and enforcement of harmful interference claims. You'll recall that it was the TAC white paper on interference limits policy that was put out on public notice by the FCC in April. Comments were filed in July. And there were a few highlights that we got from looking at those comments. First of all, there was broad support for defining the environment in which receivers would be expected to operate. But not surprisingly, commenters essentially said, devil's in the details, and many thought this should be applied to others, but not necessarily to them. It's kind of a not in my backyard kind of concept. There was also broad support for using multi-stakeholder organizations to determine what harm claim thresholds ought to be. But again, devil's in the details. Each situation is different. No one-size-fits-all template is going to work. And finally, there was support generally for a pilot project to be authorized where the concept could be tried out in the real world. Our working group looked at the candidate bands that might be appropriate for such a pilot project and agreed on the recommendation that you see here in the second major bullet to use 3.5 gigahertz as a pilot project for interference limits. Specifically, the FCC should encourage formation of a multi-stakeholder group to investigate interference limits and the use of harm claim thresholds in the 3.5 gigahertz band. Now, to recap what those terms mean, at the bottom here are quotes from the white paper on interference limits policies means ways to describe the environment in which a receiver must operate without necessarily specifying receiver performance. And the corollary harm claim thresholds are in-band and out-of-band interfering signals that must be exceeded before a system can claim that it is experiencing harmful interference. A little bit on the rationale for why the working group is recommending the 3.5 gigahertz band. This is the 3550 to 3650 megahertz band. It's currently the subject of an FCC Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, docket 12-354, and that's to authorize that band for small cell use. There was support for interference limits that was either implied or in some case it was stated by some of the commenters in that proceeding. And some of the receiver characteristics of devices that operate in those bands has been put into the technical record, and it's been pointed out that some of the receivers have very poor selectivity. So this might be a very good test case to try to clean up the usage in that band. On the other hand, the Department of Defense in that band is the incumbent user, and they rightfully cite national defense concerns as a reason not to be open about their spectrum holdings and how they use them. So that's understandable, but it does make some difficulty in trying to discuss harm claim thresholds. And even if you had the information about what's in the band, it's very dynamic. There's a diversity of coexisting systems, and how they work together is being developed in a number of other venues. So it all ends up being one complicated situation. In the small cell docket, there are actually 3 classes or tiers of protection that have to be dealt with. There's one called incumbent access, which are those that are existing in the band now. And then you have priority access, those that require a very highly reliable network to do what they want to do. You can take an example of a hospital network, for instance. And then a separate class for general authorized access, which would be opportunistic kinds of uses and would not have the same level of protection rights as the other classes. So you would have to develop harm claim thresholds for protection criteria between each of these classes. They would define how to protect the incumbent classes from the other classes and the protection that priority access class would have from general authorized class and so forth. So it's a relatively daunting and complicated issue. Now, if a multi-stakeholder group was used to define these harm claim thresholds, there are a number of players that are stakeholders. In fact, there's a lot of players that are stakeholders. You have the incumbents, both those that are in the band now or adjacent to the band now, and that's a lot of people. And then there are the new entrants that would use the small cells, and they comprise a whole variety of businesses and missions, from commercial cellular operators to electric utilities to hospitals and so forth. This slide shows what we said in June we were going to do in September, and instead of telling you what we're going to tell you, I'm just going to move on and tell you what we've done, hopefully, in the interest of time. These are the general advantages we have identified for using multi-stakeholder organizations. It's a flexible approach. You can deal with specific issues on a very tailored kind of basis. It's an informal process as opposed to a government very formal process, so that speaks to speed. Hopefully it's a collegial approach that allows collective problem solving, because you put people in the stakeholder group that are there to solve problems, not to obscure solutions. And in essence, it's a powerful tool for clarifying relevant assumptions and identifying legitimate disagreements, and that's a good result even if you don't get to the point of being able to agree on harm claim thresholds. There are reasons that the multi-stakeholder process might not be such an easy path. You lack a single authority, as you would with the FCC being in charge, but not having a single authority means you could get into intractable disputes and the inability to proceed. You have the possibility that more powerful stakeholders just won't shut up and dominate the discussion.
That's a technical term.
Potentially, there's a diminishment of disclosure requirements, since this is not necessarily the rules may not require that. And even if you get an agreement in a multi-stakeholder organization, you've still got another step, because this is not a lawmaking body, and there's some additional process if your goal is ultimately to gain the force of law. And one last challenge is that representing nascent or diffuse interests in a multi-stakeholder organization may be difficult. It's hard to get everybody that's involved in every way into such a group, because it takes time, energy, and probably money. The level of activity of the multi-stakeholder group follows a progression. And anything you can do in this progression, anything you can achieve along the way in this progression is a good result. It's great if you get to the end, but if you only can achieve one or two of the steps, that's good too. It's a step forward. So it would frame general principles, how to look at the statistics of interference, or should you look at the current situation or plan on looking at just at the future, and so on. Another activity would be to identify the parameters that need to be measured. Which parameters do you want to measure? How do you measure them? What methods do you use? Third, then, the group could go beyond that and actually determine the parameter values to use as harm claim thresholds and take into account all the various factors that pertain to that situation and use consensus decision making to determine the values themselves. And then lastly, the organization could be used to discuss or define mechanisms needed for effective enforcement. As I said, achieving any one of those four things is a achievement in itself. One of the important issues is the appropriate level of involvement of the FCC. If we're dealing with regulations ultimately, how much the FCC ought to be involved in a multi-stakeholder process is somewhat of an open question. But we at least looked at the boundaries of involvement and quickly came to the conclusion that the optimum is somewhere in between the two extremes. If the FCC is actually leading, if they're actually supervising the process, then you have all the FCC rules that come into play. It's really not much different at that point than a notice and comment rulemaking with all the disadvantages that go along with it. At the other end, if there's absolutely no FCC involvement, it's a market free-for-all. And disagreements there can cause stakeholders to just stall decisions, or you could have the equivalent of a marketplace brawl in the worst case. So somewhere in the middle is probably where this all makes sense, where the FCC encourages a multi-stakeholder process and makes some overt or insinuated signals that they're going to pay attention to that process in a particular situation, and they're going to consider those results, and then assume somewhat of a monitoring role. So active interest that empowers the multi-stakeholder organization without slowing it down is probably the goal. The FCC along the way may indicate the frequency bands where the process would be useful, where it would be appreciated, and they may want to highlight certain questions that they need asked and answered in the rulemaking process, or questions that would help avoid a rulemaking process if that were possible. The details of the structure of MSH organization, first of all, you need some kind of signal, as I said previously, from the FCC that it's going to welcome this input in a specific frequency band for recommending harm claim thresholds. Successful multi-stakeholder organizations have certain traits that seem to be common where you can find successful case studies. Typically, it's a nonprofit corporation. It's able to represent all the various stakeholder groups, and it can be technology-focused without trying to give any offense to lawyers, policy wonks, others, but it's amazing how much progress engineers and scientists can make if the political and the policy analysis stuff is all checked at the door, and that's where this process can be most useful. It, of course, needs to be open, transparent, and include a source of non-controversial funding. Membership dues seems to be a template for that. It's an open question that the group has discussed whether it's practical to have one multi-stakeholder organization, and that organization then spawns subgroups that work on specific areas, or whether separate individual organizations should behave as multi-stakeholder groups for each specific situation as it arises. That may be a practical issue, and the TAC may want to have some discussion on this at the end of this presentation. The third area of focus for the group is a radio system standards knowledge base. The need for this knowledge base is that increasingly different industries and spectrum users are all finding that the RF operating environment is changing, and it's changing because of users that they didn't have to deal with before, and they aren't really aware of, and they don't know how to talk to. So having a single place to go to look at spectrum use by disparate users would help system and receiver developers know what they're up against, and would also be a resource for regulators in deciding on assigning compatible services in adjacent spectrum or in adjacent geography. The problem with the idea of this knowledge base is twofold, and they're practical concerns. As anyone knows who's put together a big database, it's hard to put together a database. But once you do it, you're not done. It's a dynamic thing, and the real challenge in database management is how to sustain it and how to maintain it on an ongoing basis. Even if the TAC could put together a database, it's not something the TAC could do on an ongoing basis. And even the FCC can't guarantee sufficient resources to maintain such a database. And standards aren't necessarily free, so there's an ongoing cost issue. And there are many, many standards organizations, so this is not a small coordination task by any stretch of the imagination. We have a recommendation on this, and that is that the FCC should issue a notice of inquiry to initiate action by standard development organizations themselves. Specifically, the NOI would prompt SDOs to volunteer to maintain a standards knowledge base. The NOI would investigate and request minimum receiver performance specifications where they exist, ask receiver developers their needs for parameters, and ask for conformance testing requirements and specifications for each technology type. The group has queried whether some of this may fall in the wheelhouse of an organization like NIST. But in any case, the result would be a knowledge base where the SDOs maintain lists of standards associated with individual FCC rules. OET could maintain references to those SDOs, and possibly this could be referenced on the FCC Spectrum dashboard, and other appropriate references could be included if there were no specific standards in a particular area. On the topic of emerging technologies, the working group has been investigating receiver and transmitter design techniques that improve efficient spectrum use and looked at some of the implications on policy. The target result is a list of techniques that improve spectrum efficiency, and that usually means being able to tolerate more interference at the receiving device. So far, the group has looked at software-defined receivers and transmitters, interference cancellation techniques and coordination techniques, advanced receiver technologies such as high dynamic range and RF front-end improvements, advanced antenna and multi-carrier technologies such as MIMO or carrier aggregation techniques, and RF MEMS, microelectromechanical systems, and dynamically tunable front-end filters. This says there's background slides, but the working group is going beyond that and actually preparing a white paper in the fourth quarter on these issues that will explode out each of the topics there. Finally, we have the topic of interference resolution and enforcement. The goal here is a policy approach that features standardized procedures for interference resolution and enforcement in this new spectrum environment we find ourselves that is increasingly complex. The goal is to have a report on this in the fourth quarter of this year. So why is this important? Well, you can take a look at what has happened and where things are. There are some famous examples here, such as garage door openers that were near military bases, and the military bases suddenly started using communications that was on the frequency of garage door openers, and suburban areas of garage doors were going up and down for no reason. So it's an example where government and commercial spectrum user needs have to be considered and coordinated. There are multiple legislative and policy activities and actions now. You have the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the Government Accountability Office report on receiver performance, and the FCC's own public notice on the TAC white paper on interference limits and others. And all these deal with the same subjects in a slightly different way. So we have more congestion in bands, we have spectrum sharing, we have heterogeneous systems with advancing technology that are adjacent to each other, and balancing against that, there is an enforcement function that has reduced budgets and reduced resources. So there is a need for coordinated practices and tools to resolve interference issues and provide the enforcement actions that may be necessary. So for members of the group, with Dale Hatfield leading the way, we've done a background review and identified key success factors. That includes looking at the use of statistical versus worst-case assessments of interference, defining different types of interference, assessing the traditional enforcement tools and the steps and processes you need for resolving interference issues, looking at all the risks and the challenges that evolving technology brings and the ramifications, both good and bad, for advanced tools and processes. So what does success consist of? New forms of spectrum sharing require new FCC enforcement tools, especially when both federal and non-federal users are involved. Then the need for coordination between the FCC and NTIA is clear. Another success factor is mitigation measures, trying to solve interference problems prior to resolving the source of the interference, and developing technical compliance showings that can facilitate enforcement measures. This is a work in progress, and the group will be continuing its investigation into December. So with that completes the report from the working group on spectrum and receiver performance. We look forward to questions. I reiterate, we had two recommendations here. One is for the FCC to issue an NPRM on a multi-stakeholder organization in the 3.5 gigahertz band, and second is to issue a notice of inquiry on a radio system standards knowledge base. Thank you, Dennis. Back to you.
Oh, that's terrific, Lynn. A lot going on. I would just pause. That wasn't quite an NPRM that you were looking for with your recommendation, but it is to move forward on the support for a multi-stakeholder group. The reason I respond is because there was a large reaction that occurred immediately to my left when you used those words.
I got my N acronyms confused. I apologize to the group. NOI.
Yeah, right. Are there questions or comments about the report and particularly the recommendations? Brian?
Sure. Just a quick question to ask you. With respect to the interference issue, and in your report in December, I guess it is, will you be addressing or making recommendations on the interference enforcement opportunities or directions that the FCC should move into?
I think so, and I think I'll refer that to Dale. I don't know if you heard the question, but
I'll go ahead. Dale, I was just trying to figure out, because of other committees in town working on the...
What other committee could you be talking about that you chair?
Looking at the interference aspect of it and trying to figure out if there's work being done in the TAC that will make recommendations in the December time frame in terms of how to mitigate or make recommendations for mitigating interference. It may have applicability in other work that's being done to take a look at the whole broader issue of interference, particularly between government and non-government users.
And I will clarify the code. Brian is the co-chair for SISMAC group operating under NTIA, and there is a significant proceeding in that body that is moving forward. For those of you who didn't pick it up as Lynn described it. But there is a significant connection, and Dale is the proper connection between the two groups, so we're all anxious to hear what you have to say, Dale.
Thanks. At the SISMAC meeting, part of the work statement or whatever included the sort of recommendation or idea that there would be coordination between this body, the TAC, doing interference work, and the work in the SISMAC. And having said that, though there is a timing issue here, that there's a difference in timing, and I'd be anxious to hear other people's opinions too, but my feeling where we are in this body, we don't match up well with the time frame for what's going to happen in the SISMAC. So my hope would be that we would be able to give it enough thought between now and December that we can contribute at least to the framing of the issues and so forth, so that when the SISMAC then picks up, it'll have the benefits of our deliberations in the meantime. Dennis, right?
Very good.
No, and this has become a hot issue. If I could interject, this whole area that Dale has actually provided an enormous level of leadership on, both last year within this body and now within the SISMAC group. But this enforcement notion has really come to the fore. I think people are to the place where there is a belief structure that is moved that says that sharing and dynamic sharing not only technologically can work, but probably is the right answer. That doesn't say everyone believes that, but a large body are beginning to have that belief structure. Once you come to that point, the next question is, that's great, but how are we going to make sure everyone plays properly? And that's where enforcement pops its ugly head up as a real top issue. And once you've done that, as Lynn's already said, you have a lot of other considerations that you start staring at, which is the huge challenge that the FCC has in enforcement in general, with the rapid evolution to ever more complex waveforms and all of the closing the gaps between the different spectral uses. And so this is really a big issue, and we've started on it in a small way in the TAC, mostly affiliated with the interference limits, and now we're moving to the big challenge, and it is huge when you start looking at government and commercial sharing, where either government or commercial may be the primary. And even getting into jurisdictional issues, well, FCC is the enforcement body, but enforcing when the enforcement is directed at the government interfering with commercial, that's something that had not really been thought through very carefully. So big opportunity. When Dale flipped over this particular stone, the number of things that crawled out from under it were much larger than anticipated.
I would just add, in addition to this going across the boundary and sort of the jurisdictional or almost separation of power issues across the boundary, I think the other really fundamental issue is this ex ante versus ex post. How much you wanted testing and so forth that you do before you deploy, and how much you do after you deploy. And there's obvious trade-offs there in terms of innovation and so forth. So that's, I think, one of the most interesting issues is that ex ante versus ex post question.
There we go, Milo.
So I just wanted to comment. This is the 3.5 band is one of the first bands that I think the PCAST working group suggested that the spectrum access system be used to try and manage access to the band. I think we've been very active in this in the NPRM that's been going on, and have been working on a spectrum access system database that we think would avoid the need to have everybody necessarily have the same set of specifications. I think one of the things you have to think about is if you have some form of mediation of access to spectrum and the ability to compute interference potential between different users, right? That can help really empower sharing in a way that, I don't think your report mentioned a database or the ability of a SAS to try and do some of the confliction. There are a lot of users. One of the issues about 3.5 is not just users in band, but also adjacent C-band operations, right? And so we've been filing in that proceeding. We think that some of the claims there are not as strong as they might be. But even if they were, the use of a SAS could be used to protect those existing users where absolutely required. So I think you've not just got, with 3.5, not just got in-band sharing between the three layers, but also the other folks who are nearby. Yes. I think we need to address interference management in that way. And again, I think the SAS can do that in a much more sophisticated fashion than trying to have a group of people try and set one set of rules for everybody in the band.
Good. Henning.
On the enforcement side, has the group tried to kind of categorize what type of enforcements? You mentioned ex post as ex ante, but one of the differences, I think, we see is both in a positive and a negative way, namely, these devices are now not just independent radios sitting somewhere, but they're often connected to the internet, to databases that provide additional enforcement, but there are also millions of them. You can't just go out and send a van hunting each one of those down when they misbehave. So have you tried to at least categorize the kind of enforcement tools that might be available and what their trade-offs might be? Because when we talk about enforcement, the picture that people have in their mind seems to differ greatly between a more traditional version of a classical radio interference directional antenna hunting down mode versus only FCC labs, and once it leaves FCC has the FCC approval stamp on it, they're out there and nothing you can do about it. GPS receiver model, if you like.
It's an excellent question, and the notion, at least so far in the group, is that the traditional methods of enforcement fall short when you start considering all the panoply of situations that are arising now and difficult to find interference sources. So Dale has been looking into that more than anyone
I think
else.
Henning, your comment was just very well taken, and we are thinking very much about exactly those issues. That's to me is sort of the essence of what we're up to.
So if you have good ideas on how to do that,
right, exactly.
The working group very interested in hearing them.
Happy to talk about it.
Kevin?
Thanks. My question is, and maybe it's a little bit related to Milo's, the range of options of multi-stakeholder versus FCC-led sounded like many of them would be a fairly lengthy process to reach a workable solution. So I guess really my question is, can you speak to the potential for piloting this in the 3.5 gigahertz range as having any impact on the timeline for really commercial development of that band, which I view as a very important band?
Well, I don't know that I have any insight on how quickly commercialization in that band would take place, or how willing incumbents are to have commercialization take place. I think the thought is that, and wherever Pierre is, he can chime in on this, is that the multi-stakeholder group only takes a piece of this, of finding what is the harm claim threshold. They're not really going to deal with the methodology. Is pointing out about the spectrum access system is a tool, but it needs to find, it has to have a criteria by which it does a good or bad judgment, and only finding where do you draw that line. That's the only function really of the multi-stakeholder group, is what is the threshold. The other issues that come in with business and protection of federal use and a whole myriad of other issues and timelines, I'm not sure the multi-stakeholder group can really get a piece of that. Pear's the expert on interference limits generally in multi-stakeholder groups. So, did you have a comment?
I would very little add. I think you covered it very well, Lynn. I just say that the first thing is, who knows how long any process takes, 3.5 or any other one. But I would link it to what Milo said, and in fact there were a couple of filings on 3.5 that explicitly made the connection. If the SAS is going to do the right job, it needs the kind of information that is in a harm claim threshold to do that deconfliction. So the harm claim thresholds will help 3.5 be successful.
I would say, though, there is an active NPRM in 3.5, and I think the Commission is working down this process. I think the Navy's been relatively straightforward about what's required to share in 3.5. So I am actually optimistic that a lot can happen relatively quickly, but it does require that element that's almost very evasive in Washington called leadership. And I think if we can get a little bit of that, we can make progress pretty quickly.
All right. Oh, Julie.
I don't know if that was my cue. Just to be clear, I don't anticipate that this work would hold up anything that we'd be doing on 3.5. I actually see them as complementary. Part of this is, there's the elements that would go into the SAS about how the services would protect each other and the sharing and so forth. And then there's also the piece of this that gets into, we've got new equipment being designed coming into an environment that's quite complex. And so part of this exercise was, what can we do to define the environment for everybody, not just in-band, but with the adjacent services as well, so that going forward they have an idea of, this is what I should shoot for when I design equipment. Because, that's what sparked all this, was without getting into actually setting standards for receivers and regulating, but telling people, here's what's coming, so you have an obligation to design equipment that should operate in that environment.
Okay, let's move on. Shahid, take the leadership on our wireless COTS.
All right. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. That's where it is. Thank you. All right. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here to talk about the wireless COTS working group. I don't know if the charts are up, but
they're up.
There we go. Okay. First, I'd like to recognize the team. We've got a number of people involved in this working group. I'm not going to go through the names, but they're clearly on the chart above. Big thanks to Walter for again helping us out in this committee. So thank you, Walter. Just moving on to the table of contents and agenda. I'm not going to cover too much in the mission statement or our approach, but I'll walk you through that, and then we'll dive in to the preliminary recommendations and the next steps. So, our mission statement. When we first started out, as with many other subcommittees, we had to define what our role and responsibility is. So we came up with our definition of what COTS is and what benefits it could offer to wireless solutions. And I'll talk a little bit more about the definition itself. But to get the process moving, we came up with essentially 5 specific areas that we would like to use as our guiding principle. First, lowering the cost of entry for wireless applications. Again, the more you reuse, the more you leverage, as we've seen with other applications, this is definitely a place for wireless. Accelerating deployment of wireless solutions, limiting the necessity for having or bringing your own spectrum to the vertical. And we've seen this across the board with many of the verticals we've spoken to, whether it's a utility, public safety, or a oil and gas company. They all want their own spectrum. And I think there's some opportunity here for efficiency, but it also brings its own challenges. And we talked about interference and sharing of spectrum a few minutes ago. And finally, spectrum efficiency and how different resources could be shared. The attached slide articulates our overall approach. Our approach was really grounded by talking to different verticals and speaking to the industry in general. The idea was to gain consensus, understand their requirements of various different verticals that leverage wireless solutions today. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, we spoke to a number of utility companies, including Southern Company and Ameren and others. And they all had one common requirement, which is they want to build their own wireless network. Some of them want to leverage existing commercial networks, and I applaud them for doing that. But many of or at least the ones we spoke to, wanted to build their own network, and for that matter, wanted to have their own spectrum for that purpose. I'm sure we've seen that debate and heard that call for action a number of times. And a lot of these companies, incidentally, cited Canada, especially the utilities. Apparently, in Canada, they have their own spectrum for applications such as smart grid and smart metering. So that's quite interesting. Nonetheless, we did speak to other verticals. We also spoke to the automobile companies, device manufacturers, and so on. We conducted these interviews over the summer, which was challenging by itself, trying to get all the schedules nailed during the holidays. And here we are today to summarize our findings and make some recommendations. So in essence, the whole idea was to come up with a industry point of view as opposed to a perspective generated by our group here. Okay, so our preliminary recommendations. First and foremost, we need to come up with a robust definition on what COTS is. There is a lot of confusion in the marketplace related to that. Some think of COTS as a standardized technology or an architecture. Some think of it as a de facto technology that's widely available. But I think there needs to be some sort of recognition, driven by FCC or like entity to define what it is. Because I think to bring and canvas all these industries and sectors together, we'll need to have a common understanding of what it means. Second, we need to define and identify what the spectrum sharing opportunities are under these commercial constructs. So there's a number of different applications that could leverage a common spectrum. However, again, they all bring their own unique nuances, their own requirements and challenges. And I think there needs to be some sort of framework through which we can define spectrum sharing. Conversely, there are also challenges, and we talked about the 3.5 gigahertz, where there's interference issues. And one of the things that we heard from one of the constituents was that maybe there is a single entity where, and I don't know if the group worked on this or not, but that could define what the framework for sorting out interference issues are. And somebody recommended they ought to be some sort of analytics, big data index, if you will, to really define, what is driving, what one application is driving interference and what's not. And you can do this without actually getting into the actual debate and identify those and prioritize those ahead of time. Sorry. And the last one is, and this is something we probably will end up doing before our December meeting, is to have a industry-wide workshop with the enterprises, the verticals, the sectors who are driving towards building their own networks and bringing their own spectrum, for that matter, and try to also at the same time bring in the service provider community, because our hypothesis is, and it's I think quite true in today's LTE networks and other networks that are out there today, that many of those commercially available networks could be used for some of those applications that these verticals are striving to build. So I think there needs to be some sort of get-together, for lack of a better word, to see if there is a way we can bring these industries and sectors together and meet their demands at the same time. So that's sort of our overall recommendation until the December meeting. I'm not going to go through all the bullet points here detailing out each one of these recommendations, but the plan is between now and December to further define our recommendations, collect some additional feedback from my peers here and the members of this TAC and others in the industry through the workshop I just talked about, and then present those as a final recommendation in our December meeting. So I think I've broken the record for finishing up way ahead of time, but I'll open up for questions and answers.
You have indeed. It was very quick. But Henning, you're on.
When you, I'm sure, very graciously, politely pushed back on this issue of building their own network, did you get any kind of consistent response from all of these, what will eventually be siloed, smokestack, non-integrated offerings?
Each sector brought their own unique requirements. If you look at the utility folks, they have a latency requirement that is quite restrictive in a sense that it's not easily available, and you can easily see why they need it, right? You want to, for demand generation and smart grid applications, you can see that kind of requirement. But nonetheless, I think some of the commercially available networks, especially the LTE, new form LTE networks, have that capability in play, and so they have QoS, class of service, latency, coverage, those kinds of requirements, and they're somewhat justifiable. But at the same time, if the service provider community and the utility sector got together, and I think they could be a easily definable solution.
Good. Henning.
So you mentioned as one of the items to discuss kind of a definition of what COTS may be. I wonder if a group has, you hinted at that a little bit, arrived at a conclusion that it might actually be hard to essentially have a binary definition. Somebody is, well, you basically can look at a technology, a request, an application, and say, yep, this fits the COTS bucket, or nope, it's outside, type of thing. What I hear a little bit is that there are degrees of that, which may not have existed in the past. What you seem to see a fair amount, we see that in FirstNet as one example, where there's a discussion of a standards-based technology, namely 4G LTE using 3GPP, widely implemented industry standards, but on a separate band and, depending on who's speaking, various degree of either operational or spectrum separation and sharing that's going on.
Yep.
So I wonder if it wouldn't be more helpful to, instead of just separating the world into COTS good, not COTS bad type of thing, into aspects of that and not. The other aspect which I'm hearing, and this is an interesting one that I haven't heard discussed from an economic perspective. Often what I'm hearing, particularly utility one, is where you're essentially doing local optimization. Namely, you're taking a resource that is free, namely spectrum that you believe to be free or should be free for you, obviously, because you're so valuable, because it lowers your complexity, cost, dependencies, whatever else, but you're indirectly imposing costs on somebody else, namely other uses which couldn't occur, auctions that don't take place, performance that other applications don't get, etc. So I wonder if you've looked at and asked specifically, maybe because it's a standard framework, and I'm not an economist, but I might have lunch with him, is what...
Close enough.
Close enough. Counts for expertise. Is that you have that is really, as usual, about money. Yeah. Namely, and you mentioned that in terms of, is there market failure? For example, that in many cases the markets are niches that are too small to attract nationwide providers, for example. What can you do about that? As opposed to simply a technology problem.
Yeah, no, great question. I think from an economic standpoint, first, obviously there's trade-offs from a industry perspective, right? You take spectrum from point A, put it to point B, there's obviously trade-off there, right? But internally within that sector, there is a economics trade-off, which is around supply chain. If you build a network specifically to a different spectrum that's not widely available, obviously, the costs, the cost basis of everything from devices through operations through manufacturing, everything kind of rises up. So, arguably the manufacturers and OEMs themselves don't want to go into this because it's just cost prohibitive in that respect. So the other thing I would say, utilities are an interesting bunch because they a lot of their business cases are based on rate cases. So they make the case of the utility commission, and then that they raise the cost for us consumers, and they add on the capital expense to build it. So it's not it's atypical, say, for a private enterprise from a business case standpoint. But we have to see what's happening in Canada. Apparently, they have allocated spectrum specifically for that application, and yet to be seen as to A, utilities are taking advantage of it, and B, are these cost-effective solutions so that at the end of the day, the consumers who are enjoying the service are actually seeing some benefit. I think the jury is still out. Still too early to say. I haven't seen an application purpose-built. Obviously, a lot of SCADA systems by utilities have been built for a number of years, but now we're talking large-scale networks to manage large-scale data that's coming out of the grid.
Have you looked at the discussions within FirstNet? As I see that as an interesting illustration where, not having been closely involved, I see an evolving of thinking where there was indeed, we started out, if you like, with an integrated network, possibly with prioritization for public safety. That didn't quite work out because of public safety concerns. But now there seems to be a bit of a reconvergence once people start looking at the numbers, the dollar signs, as to whether a wholly separate network is fundable as well. And so that might be an interesting test case for kind of the thinking and the trade-offs that are going on. And the device costs and others that you've mentioned are very much one part of that discussion as well. So that might be kind of a retrospective one where you have some history of discussion in a broader community to see what the back and forth is in a particular area where there are indeed stringent requirements for survivability, latency, special services such as direct access, direct communication between end systems, and so on.
Yep. No, I agree. FirstNet obviously is going to be a nationwide network and has its own unique nuances. But some of the utilities, again, very regional, smaller footprints, relatively speaking.
Kevin?
Given that the barrier to getting people more aligned with common usage of spectrum or joint use of spectrum, which I think from the comments and from discussions last year, I think we all believe shared usage of spectrum and shared technologies is by far the most efficient way to do it. But what I guess I haven't heard yet is any mention of how the new networking technologies might come to bear to help overcome those barriers, and that is the virtualization of network functions and going to software-defined networking. Because that has the potential, on one side of making it economical to have many of the functions in the network specialized for a given application, whether it's machine-to-machine or it's for public safety or for whatever. A mobile packet core could be built on a small, medium, large scale, whatever, on virtualized data center infrastructure and customized. And on the other side, the potential for network slicing even of the RAN resources, so that the RAN resources could be sliced, if you will, for different applications and could be dynamically changed under emergency situations or other things like that. So I guess my question is has the team been looking at these newer networking technologies to see how that might help overcome what has been the barriers before to getting people to share?
Yeah, no, thanks, Kevin, for bringing that up. No, we didn't look into SDN or virtualization at a very detailed level. Although, if you look at COTS, it's a continuum, and you can almost look at it a layered approach. I think somebody brought that up in the last meeting we had here. That everything from common physical layer 1 type stuff all the way up to the application software level, right? If you look at it from that lens, obviously SDN and other virtualization technologies could come in play, whether it's virtualizing your EPC or your other parts of your network. I think, clearly SDN will have a role to play in COTS, but we didn't get into the technology side of it as opposed to just looking at mainly from an application vertical perspective. But something we should probably look into that, so I'll definitely make a note of it.
Okay. Paul?
I think Walter was before me.
Yeah, I'm going to wait for Walter.
Oh, okay.
That's the disadvantage of being the guy who runs the meeting. He gets to go last.
So,
thank you.
Get the riffraff out of the way. Shade, one other thing you might want to have a look at, I don't know if you've been tracking it or not, what's going on in Mexico is kind of interesting as well. This notion of 90 megahertz of dedicated spectrum with an MNO that's, their vision's a bitstream provider.
Yeah.
And then they drive various services as MVNOs off of that with when you press on it, the degree of regulation gets a little bit fuzzy in terms of what the MVNO is and what they're trying to do, but it's another model that's starting to materialize.
No, we're the whole MVNO is making a comeback apparently, we did hear when we talked to telematics guys and even some of the other smaller vendors such as Nest. One of the things they did bring up is around the concept of an MVNO serving up different verticals. So it's kind of interesting. I will look into this Mexico use case. Thank you.
Walter, last but certainly not least.
Just a couple of thoughts that we got out of the discussions with the carriers I wanted to add on. First, none of the discussions we had were black and white, and sometimes when we give a summary, you tend to contrast things too darkly. These are rational companies. They all had a story that we use commercial services where we can, and then they went into instances where they don't think they can use COTS or commercially based services. The two things that stood out in my mind were companies talking about service guarantees, whether it was service guarantees in terms of reliability or bandwidth or performance. But it's clear that one of the things that drives them to building their own infrastructure is a belief that they can't get a service guarantee in the marketplace. That's changing. Only 10 years ago, this was a voice business. Now it's a broadband data business, and the technologies are changing, so I'm not sure it's a case of market failure. But clearly they're putting out a challenge that if sharing requires guarantees in terms of what that sharing entails. The other thing that stood out is that in areas where they would like to use COTS technology, and everybody thinks using COTS technology has some benefits in terms of cost, so they're driven away from COTS when it doesn't meet their needs, but they do see that it's certainly a cheaper alternative when they can use it. And typically the other dimension we got to that coin was a lot of these companies span areas that are not commercially viable, and they need to build plant infrastructure in areas that aren't commercially viable. To the extent that we suggested using COTS as an approach, that brings in spectrum sharing issues. So one of the issues in remote areas where you want to, and maybe there are benefits. We didn't get into this a lot, but we thought that extending a common technology platform into remote areas, it might have benefits. If an enterprise builds out into a remote area and it's shareable in some context, that can certainly have benefit for those people and those institutions that live in those remote areas. But that was the other thing that really came in, and I think the net I took away was this belief that focusing on enterprise needs, if we want to expand on a COTS theme, is probably one of the things we're going to face in terms of supporting that. It cuts across utility companies, public safety, just lots and lots of enterprises who say, you're putting your daily running of your business on infrastructure. You need some assurance that business is going to be well supported. And one other point, even in our discussions with these companies, to Henning's point, we didn't even have a binary definition of COTS. We had a continuum of definitions that we offered as talking points, recognizing that COTS range from virtual networks to deploying an LTE technology with dedicated spectrum to deploying it maybe even in new bands to take advantage of the technology. We opened it up to all discussions, but we saw potential as well as inhibitors, in the market.
Okay, please don't throw. Goes to Russ.
You got one more.
I was just going to make a small build on Walter's good comments. We did these really interesting interviews which Shahid told us about. I think in addition to, or maybe it's a build on, that these companies are looking for guarantees. They're also looking for guarantees about data privacy, which is very interesting. Like one of the examples was Ford Motor Company, that they feel a real like an obligation to their customers that any data that they transfer from the vehicle is then private, and so it brings up a lot of really tricky questions, but good ones. So for whether it's I do still agree that like not building the separate networks is a more effective way to go about it, but we need to somehow give them the capability to design the right privacy, the right QoS, the right the right treatment of the data for their customers too. So it was interesting. It was good. Thanks. Good job, Shahid.
Good. As we pass the baton to Russ to talk about resiliency, I would point out that though you had the shortest presentation, you had the longest discussion following the presentation. So you did accomplish you accomplished your objective very nicely. Russ, please take it away on resiliency.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis. Slides? There we go. Oh, okay. So our group is focused on the resiliency of the network. And one of the charges is trying to look at how to make the network more resilient than it is today in 5, 10, or 15 years. So first off, I want to thank the working group team members. We've had some extremely good meetings over the past 3 months. I want to thank Henning, our FCC CTO advisor, and just want to recognize some of the folks because as we broke into 3 groups over the summer, we had 3 to 4 meetings a week sometimes trying to, and some of the people were on the same sub team. So I just want to thank them for their dedication. Okay. Next slide. So as I said, we broke into 3 teams. Those 3 teams were the physical plant team, which thanks to Doug Jones from Verizon for leading that. We also had an investigate policy, current regulations and priorities that Mark Bayless read, and then reporting metrics and forecasting, as well as service substitution and diversification, which I continued to lead those meetings. We met with a key number of executive stakeholders, also created an intent statement around what we wanted to do with some of the data that's being collected. We had a liaison with the security team, and we probably need to strengthen that as we start to look at cloud in the final lap here of the next 3 months and some of the issues around cloud, and then the regular weekly meetings. We also have a white paper that we'll be delivering in December that will focus on a lot of the detailed information. In fact, we had a meeting today going over some of those very detailed plans on the white paper, and I want to thank John Barnhill, who will be presenting a few slides in a few minutes. So the first thing that we noticed, by the way, there we go. As the network has evolved into this IP transition, it's become about the power supply. And, the network of record is still the landline, so to speak, which was the old minus 48 volts from the central office. But that's no longer the network of majority. And we'll give you some figures on that. So, the bottom line is the network has evolved. Unfortunately, evolution takes a lot of power. Consumer devices, broadband modems, routers, PCs, tablets, smartphones, all these things have plugs. There's, you have a router behind your modem, you have VoIP boxes, different things. Service providers' networks have also evolved greatly. Broadband modems, broadband access elements, NIDs, pedestals, wireless towers, routers, etc. And there's multiple areas of powered equipment out in the network. Application service providers, there's also this new need for a non-network-based services platform, which really relies on the underlying network for power. And then there's what we'll be looking at in the next 3 months, too, is the coming impact of Internet of Things, or as some people call it, machine-to-machine. This will just make the problem amplified, in our opinion. So one of the things that was interesting, roughly a month ago, there was a report released, the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. It's a fairly decent report. The link is on the slide here. It's 208 pages. So it's a fairly lengthy report as well. It covers everything from insurance issues to the network and some of the network resiliency items. Some of the key points that we pulled out of this were, recommendation 16 about developing a resilient power strategy for wireless and data communications. Network infrastructure that should function when the electrical grid's down. And then consumer equipment, the need to encourage either consumers or providers to provide battery backup. Interesting to note, in the report, a couple metrics, 8.5 million people were out of power in the initial assessment, and 25% of the cell sites were down. And as you'll see, wireless has become really the predominant service. So it's a fairly important issue when 25% of the network's down. And the other interesting point, about 24 government agencies were involved, but the FCC was not part of that report. So on the physical plant side, we broke this down into, as I talked about, consumer, distribution, and wire centers. And it's very interesting that the diagram on the right kind of gives you an idea where there's pluggable power, and then there's little icons for plug or potentially battery backup. It doesn't necessarily mean there's battery backup in these network diagrams. On the consumer side, power reliability is critical. Consumers don't typically have generators of their own or UPSs. That's not the norm. Line power has become the exception, and some providers provide battery backup, some don't. On the distribution side, there's varied architecture, some fiber to the home, fiber to the node, HFC, DSL, etc. Cell sites and small cells, Wi-Fi. Some of these have power backup, but it's very much varied and by provider again. Wire centers and head ends, typically these are well backed up with battery or generator. So we focused really on the distribution side and a bit on the consumer side because we felt the head end or wire center was in fairly good shape. So the quick assessment, by the way, what we did, the power issues are really out of the oversight of the FCC. So we took that into consideration. You'll see that in our preliminary recommendations. As far as we can tell, there's no formal FCC liaisons to FERC or other power regulations groups. There's lack of shared priorities between power companies and providers. There's some best practices, so don't take that wrong. There's a lot of providers that have really good best practice relationships built with some of their local power companies. But it's not a standard of any sort. Priority of restoration is lacking, and this is one of the things we need to really focus on in the next few months here is how do you prioritize, what gets restored first? Everyone thinks, well, that should be easy. You've got emergency, you've got hospitals, but everybody becomes important when there's no power or no network. So there's work to be done there. Also, one of the policies that seems to be prevalent in many areas by power companies and not trying to make enemies with them. However, they do go through a lot of times and do what's called clear cutting when there's a major disaster, which means they potentially remove a lot of working plant on the communication side where they're trying to just get all the cables and mess out of the way. And then there's some regional and local peering issues that if there is a failure, it creates a single point of failure typically and is very difficult to deal with. Before I get into the reporting metrics, I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to talk about the services substitution.
Okay, thank you. This part of the analysis that we did came out of a recurring comment that the reliability of an individual wireline service isn't as critical when everybody's got a wireless phone. So there was this discussion that we should actually go out and verify that to the extent we could. And then, so what we're going to show you is sort of the analysis that we did there. So if you look at the way the slide's organized, we're testing the thesis that multiple services means that you have more higher availability, which is the case. And so we went in and looked at the latest report from the Center of Disease Controls that analyzes the households in the United States and which have what types of technologies. And as you see here, if you combine on the upper slide, the blue part and the red part, you'll get to almost 90% of American households have have wireless, and half of American households have both wireless and wireline. And then the wireline only percentage is 8.6% of the households, which equates to a number over 10 million U.S. households still have only fixed wireline service as their main communication service. And then there's a fairly consistent group that has no phone service. Now, the bottom slide actually comes from the Pew Center, and they just published an update to their broadband deployment guidelines. Because there was the view that we shouldn't just consider voice technologies like landline and wired. We should consider the broadband network because other communication is happening over that network. Who has that? And this measures U.S. adults. So the two data sets don't map, and you can't take one group out of one and say this maps 100% to the other. But it is interesting to see that when you start to look at the broadband numbers, 70% of the U.S. adults have access to either broadband, fixed broadband at home, or broadband and a smartphone at home. And then another 10% of the adults have access to a smartphone on top of those that have a fixed service. So that brings you up to 80% of the adults in the U.S. population have some sort of access to broadband. There's another 3% that get on the network via dial-up, but that's fairly constant. It hasn't changed as much in the last couple of years. So particularly want to thank Stephen Bloomfield from the Center for Disease Controls, who authors the report on the top, for clarifying some of the data for us, and Catherine Zakur from the Pew Center for doing the same for her report. Now, this is a closer examination of the data that the Center for Disease Control reports, because we thought it was such a compelling trend, it was important to show that to the TAC in real numbers. So these are the same numbers that were generated on the previous pie slide in the upper, but it's just showing how these segments have changed throughout the history of the report from the CDC. And as you can see now, the upper column that you see in green is the wireless-only households. And so that's in a slide how that's growing. And then in the red candle is those that have both fixed and wireless service. And then the bottom candle, the blue, are those that are wireline only. So the trend is clear. It is becoming wireless is becoming the dominant service. Those who rely on wireline only do so less and less, and over time, this trend continues through the future when you talk to the people who do that. Even though there are some indicators that you could be slowing down somewhat on that bottom number, but it's compelling the way the data is going. Now, so those are the two things, and that was all, again, like I say, it was to answer the question, do Americans, because they have more choices, largely have a more resilient communications service when all is considered than they did with just a straight-up one-level service? And we believe that the answer to that is yes, and it's becoming primarily a wireless service for consumers. Okay?
The answer is that it's becoming no, because they're going to be only wireless, and they're not going to have a backup.
That's true, but if you go wireless only, you have the you remove some of the complexities of the outside plant, the access network, some of the dependencies that you have there. You might consolidate in a wireless tower where you actually are putting more resources to make sure it never goes down. Not that it can't go down, but it never goes down. So in some ways, you could argue that it could be more resilient. I think it's hard to argue that one service is more resilient than having two separate services, especially when one is a wired service that has its own infrastructure. But it's the way consumers are voting, and that's the trend, is ultimately is towards a more wireless world.
Where does, just a curiosity in these numbers, where does non-traditional wireline VoIP type services fit in?
Yeah, so
it seems like you've got people up there who are broadband plus wireless voice, but who could have wired voice if they wanted it trivially.
This is absolutely the case. So if you look at the wireline number that the CDC tracks, because they do this via a telephone survey, there's a I mean, if they called you and said, "Do you have a fixed service?" What's a fixed service? I didn't know it was broken. And so there are limits to what the CDC are willing to do in a survey in order to keep the data clear from survey to survey. So when you compare sort of the raw numbers to the numbers that TIA reports, you assume that spread across that full landscape of about 60% of the people that still have a fixed service, that somewhere around 35% of that is probably voice over broadband service. And then moving up the chain, as you project that out, TIA is projecting that just under half, when you get to 2017, of the fixed lines will be voice over IP. So that's where that goes.
Even beyond voice over IP as a wireless service are what you might think of as wireline voice with no assigned number. So the Skypes of the world who aren't using a number. I'm just thinking because from a disaster recovery perspective, right, I don't necessarily have to have a phone number.
Right.
If I have broadband, then I don't normally use it for voice. I use my cell for voice, but my cell tower is down, but my broadband is up.
Absolutely.
You know, I might be Skyping. That might not be my normal, but it's not. Yeah, it's not a.
Which is exactly why Marvin wanted the broadband numbers on here because nobody was tracking that specific thing in the data sets.
And if you look at it, there are almost 70% of households have wireline broadband. That is more households than have wireline voice, which means some of the wireless-only households have wired broadband, and therefore have this alternate backup. But they're not currently have a phone number, as you say.
But they only have the backup if they have power on the wire.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
That's absolutely true. But I was just trying to understand the modality because I mean we easily could be headed for a world where one's normal phone number is mobile, but there is this other capability sitting there for those who have cable or DSL or something.
We acknowledge that, but it's not something that's tracked by anybody specifically on a household or an adult basis. So it becomes difficult to correlate all the potential factors. So Russ is kicking me under the table to reclaim my time. This next section was done by Doug Jones from Verizon, who is sitting back here enjoying not having to talk about it, I think. And the next part of the discussion it's one thing to talk about prevention and resiliency. The second discussion is when a disaster does happen, how do you respond? And so what we decided to do for today was to highlight a couple of initiatives that industry service providers do in the case of a large event like this to step in and help recover the network and to maintain interim communications during the failure. And it varies by company, by their size, what their individual needs are, but generally there's an entire part of each of the service providers that are focused on emergency response and recovery. And they have these mobile incidents centers. They provide trailers that are equipped to support various community needs. They have equipment that's either on trucks or of different descriptions where they can roll in portable towers, provide different types of interim services while they're doing that, and the acronyms add up to different types of wildlife. You've got the colts, you've got cows, and you've got rats, and you'll see those as you go through. And but one of the things that's being used more and more is as more and more people overbuild public Wi-Fi. Public Wi-Fi is becoming a resource for that. So if we take an example of that, during the last hurricane, the Wi-Fi became actually really important for Hurricane Sandy recovery. The MSOs had gotten together a couple of years ago to build this joint venture to make their Wi-Fi infrastructure available to each other's subscribers. But during Hurricane Sandy, Comcast even took that a step further and just opened up their access to anybody who needed access and made it publicly available for the period of time that people were so compromised on their ability to communicate.
Could you say that one more time? How did Comcast do that? Well, you just said it where they opened. In other words,
they just let random people who needed access use their network as if it were a public Wi-Fi network instead of a subscriber-based network.
No access control.
Well.
But that's login with your Comcast ID.
Yeah.
Oh, so you had to be a Comcast customer.
No, you did not have to do that. Typically.
Normally you do. Oh, yeah. No, I understand that. Okay, I get it. Okay, thank you.
Right. So it was something that they felt like they were just giving to the citizenry to be able to communicate during the crisis. And so we think that's the kind of thing that more and more we will see, where the service providers very quickly respond to these types of things and dedicate a tremendous amount of their corporate resource to making sure people can communicate.
So another just procedural question. Does the FCC have the ability in an emergency to mandate that the carriers open up? It's similar to what Comcast did voluntarily. Can the FCC mandate that or not?
I don't think we've got the people at the table who can answer that question.
Okay, just curious.
People at the table would like not to answer.
If I knew the answer, I would.
I wasn't trying to be difficult. I just wondered whether...
There's generally been an interest from public safety, in particular, to facilitate what I think everybody agrees is quite helpful to do that. That's, I think, a active discussion in the Public Safety Bureau is how can we facilitate these things so they happen with planning expeditiously and appropriately when disasters are not as predictable as a storm happen. For example, after the Boston Marathon, this was another incident where that was at least partially exercised.
One other related question for the technical experts. Can network shaping be used in an environment like this to allow for certain types of quality of service prioritization? So that certain types of messages or certain classes of users can automatically be enabled for a higher class of service?
It could be.
It could be, but there's a lot of policy implications associated with that, and a whole fight that we'll leave to Brian to adjudicate over there. All right. Okay, here we are. So Doug came up with this R-cubed slide to talk about resiliency as the primary planning activity, but then responsive and then restoral when you do have a problem. And I'll just skip down to the cell site issue. The FCC is doing work right now for wireless on the various issues, but in general, the fact that 75% of the wireless towers survived Hurricane Sandy, considering what happened, may not be that bad. And so there's lots of discussions about what the power policy should be, whether it's battery or generator. But regardless, the carriers, the service providers have a large interest in keeping those things up and running. So everybody's got a policy. It just varies between providers what is there. The second thing, these different acronyms, CALs, COLTS, RATs, each company sort of has their own staging around. And these things have been used in the California wildfires. They were used after the Oklahoma tornadoes blew through there. They're used during hurricane recovery, including Hurricane Sandy. So they have the ability on very short notice, once it's safe, to parachute this equipment in. They pre-stage it when a storm is forecast, and it's just part of the network operations function that they do during emergencies.
That was good. Okay, so I'm going to take back over here on reporting, metrics, and forecasting. And I think one of the key points that it was just made, that John made even, and I brought up this 25% of the cell sites were out of service during Sandy. Is that good or bad? How do we know? So without reporting or metrics or forecasting, we even talked about this, how do you create a baseline of what's good or what's bad? When you consider a Category 5 or a greater hurricane hitting, 25 may be very good, that only 25 went down. So where we're trying to move with this really is moving from what I think most people look at data today on the metrics is forensics after the fact, to how can we use some of that data to do more predictability of how reliable a storm will be or how reliable a network will be in the face of a disaster. So a couple of the key points, obviously, here comes what I call the hard points, or the reality. there's a general reluctance to recreate the circuit switched era of metric reporting for VoIP. And not to mention, VoIP can be a service that you subscribe to on your broadband, as we talked about. So they may not be tied together in terms of those two metrics, or in terms of those two providers or capabilities. There's also, avoid placing, there's teams of people with companies, or there's dedicated people who provide such data to FCC and other government agencies. So avoid placing administrative burden on service providers for data requests. The FCC does require, though, information for interconnected VoIP providers with exceptions today. And those are very, very large outages typically. No reporting is currently required for underlying broadband infrastructure. So some of the guiding questions that we came up to when we approached this, we started from the very beginning. Okay, first, what's the intent? What's the desired goal of collecting data to begin with? Because everybody we would ask initially, is data being collected? Oh, yeah. What's being done with the data? And what do you want to do with the data? Where do you want to go? Is the right data being collected? We're still, I think, operating on what was the network of record, which was landline. How will regulatory bodies use the collected data? Will the data be made public or kept private? How will data be used to establish a baseline, as I talked about? And just a point, and I think we see this from the industry itself, they have very stringent, typically internal data gathering methodologies that they monitor and manage their own networks. And I think some of these best practices that were just pointed out point to some of the value that there's industry efforts and partnerships that are happening. Even with the question, can the FCC mandate that? I think what you see in some of these disasters is the providers getting together and trying to do what's best, really. So one of the things we came up with was this intent statement on what the intent of data collection is. So I'll read this real quickly. Data gathered over extended periods of time can help industry, government, and researchers identify performance trends, root causes, correlations of network outages, particularly as the underlying network technologies, operational practices, and organizational structures change. So that's a mouthful, but the bottom line there is to be able to identify those performance trends, what the causes are, and what correlations. And correlations brings into the fact that when you say 25% of the cell sites were down, what's the other data? You need to correlate that with other data. The other piece, data collected in real time during outages improves situational awareness, facilitates focusing on critical needs, and identifies where additional resources or alternative means of communications are most urgently needed. This could be very useful instead of 5 wireless companies rolling out colts or cows or rats. Maybe there could be a concerted effort of you guys go to this area or spread and divide almost. But there's information that could be shared. Long-term goals would include better forecasting, predicting, modeling, and planning for the various stages of both recovery and restoration. So some of the preliminary recommendations and next steps from the team, and not to overuse the workshop and summit bubble here, but there's some critical information. Yeah, so I was joking with Henning that, you're going to have to build a workshop room here. But, what floor would that be? Yeah, okay. But no, it's very critical because you have a lot of players here in some of these areas, and I think we've all realized that, we've done a few workshops in the past on different topics, but we need to get a lot of this information out and aired in terms of whether it's the consumer education program that we're proposing. The bottom line was on this that consumers need probably better awareness, but they also need to have some responsibility in resiliency and restoration. Just as, this is my resiliency, I need to remember to charge it. Or, I've got a battery sitting out in the driveway, that I can charge it on. FCC and the power industry regulators, currently there is no real coordination that we could find. We feel that the FCC could take a leadership role and leverage the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Strategy Action Report that I showed earlier. To do that, I think would really require some sort of a summit between the different agencies involved in disaster recovery. And the team, recommended that, other areas like liaisons to the Public Utilities Commission and power regulation groups as well. Providers could take a leadership role here as well. Providers often require what CPE either is used or can be used by consumers, whether you purchase it or not. There's usually acceptable products that are identified. So what we're looking at there is efficiency, product chaining, as we called it, for powering, and service labeling. Also take part in the consumer education program to let consumers know if they have backup on certain devices or what that would be if there is backup. Let's see. Also, providers actively monitor power supplies throughout their distribution network. We think there's a bit of a possibility for them to even let the power companies know where power's out or where, because they know in advance typically, because it's very active monitoring in the telecommunications environment. And then on the Consumer Electronics Association end, labeling and efficiency. And by the way, I forgot to point out on the provider side, there is a work in progress that's on the link there where there's a group focused on the efficiency of products. And as you get more and more powered products in the home, it obviously would be nice if they're more and more efficient and take less and less power. CEA, which could be done in partnership with some of these other efforts, is labeling and efficiency. And the FCC can also implement or accelerate some of that implementation. Preliminary recommendations around policy, potential to create a data exchange where the creation of common or shared database among key infrastructure providers, joint policy with power providers in terms of the national communication system being dependent on reliable power. We think that the FCC could play a role there, like I mentioned, and bring that together. Also on the restoration sharing policy, there's an opportunity to set prioritization, coordinate during the restoration project between providers, between different utilities, et cetera, and also to take a look at the regional and local peering options. And then finally, on the third set of preliminary recommendations, FCC to develop a data analytics ability. This is where it becomes important in setting baselines, but for the current NORS and DERS data that's collected, DERS is what's collected in a disaster, but what's really being done with it, we're going to get a deeper dive here in the next few weeks that Henning's going to set up. But yeah, the bottom line is there's really not a deep data analytics team set up at the FCC today. Also leverage the FCC MBA program, which is the Measured Broadband America program. And that's something that's currently being used to monitor broadband data from consumers. The only issue there is it's very limited scale. There's about 10,000 white boxes, I think, that are used for that. So it wouldn't give you great localized data. And then partner with the different organizations, CDC, DHS, FEMA. It was interesting when John was talking to CDC, he said, one of your requests to them was, could you request more specific data on VoIP? And they said, no, we're not interested. It's not their core. They were basically wondering how to get access to people. And then, so these are just a list of some areas we plan to explore over the next 3 months as we work towards very formal, actionable recommendations. Power backup recommendations for the various active network elements. Applying metrics to the underlying network for VoIP services, not a very popular one, by the way. Explore ways to modernize data collection analysis and set a baseline, maybe a notice of inquiry being set up. Data exploration by academics and industrial researchers, again, the concern on privacy and sharing there. Disseminate reliability data to consumers on the various services. Again, the MBA program comes up. I think I've hit that one. And then work with the CEA and other fora to create a more standard plug for battery backup, similar to some of the backups we have for cell phones and different devices today. And provider labeling of equipment to provide consumer awareness. So it's been a busy summer. We have a lot of work ahead of us. And in addition, what came up this morning was, we also need to take a look at the resiliency of the cloud outside of just the physical network. So even though we're the largest working group, we may need some more people. So I had to get that in there. By the way, we do have additional support slides on some of the metrics. I'll just say the metrics and some of the pie charts, I want to thank John for all the work in pulling those together, and some of the other team members, Marvin and others. We spent a good 2 hours discussing those on calls, so there's going to be a zillion questions, but it may be better to handle some of those offline. There's additional details on demographic breakdowns and adoptions of services, which are important as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ. Our time is fleeting by, so if you could make your questions short and to the point with the expected answer being yes or no, that would be much appreciated. But Peter, go ahead. Okay, Milo. I was going to go in order round. But go ahead, Milo. You're on.
All right.
Go.
So, mic's on. Given the issues with the CDC data, and it was interesting that since it's a phone survey, I don't understand why they could show people who had no phone service in it. But the FCC is the expert agency, and it would be great if the commission actually owned that process and did it in a way that was comprehensive, could cover VoIP, and also cover commercial locations, because the CDC data was only for residential, and I don't think that really gives a good indication of adoption there. So for a topic that's this critical, the only studies I ever hear people say, quote, are the CDC data. So the FCC really should own this, and I would like the working group to consider actually creating a formal recommendation to do that.
But general, besides just the cost issues, is that we are subject to the Paperwork Reduction Act. So any new survey that we would do would have to go through OMB approval. And that is a major hassle to go through. So I'll just mention that.
In the spirit of Dennis's request, yes.
But I'll add one thing. The FCC collects a tremendous amount of data that's available relative to the type of service that's deployed, whether it's VoIP, whether it's wireline, whether it's wireless, and all that's in there. But it's not correlated to households, which is what we were trying to gauge, was the resiliency issue of the availability of a household to get to somebody when they're in trouble.
Peter.
Well, first of all, I just want to observe, I do have a generator. And if a generator has one flat tire, it can only go in circles. So you might want to work on air compressors for flat tires, but that wasn't my comment. Anyway, not to be too controversial, but John's comment that using network shaping and those kinds of things to basically prioritize who can use the network during a crisis will invite a lot of fights. And I would just like to say that we should have the fights now and not during the crisis. And then I'd like to offer one other analogy, which is, many communities have moved towards red light devices where fire trucks can basically trigger all the green lights and they can get through, but other people can't. I think that's kind of an analogy where local communities, basically came up with a technology that substantially increased the effectiveness of their first response capability at a relatively low cost with a relatively low technology impact. And I wonder if there are potential technology solutions like that that might apply in this domain as well.
Yes.
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 The only reason why I did mention that other people were looking at the issue about who should have priority is because it was a topic of the CISRIC a couple of years ago, and it was part of their report. And it's still ongoing, that work to define if there was a priority treatment, who would get it, and what the policy is. So just outside the scope of what we are prepared to look at in the next 3 months, other than to reference other work being done.
Okay.
Yeah, one other comment on the generators that came up, and just from the service provider point of view, they put a lot of generators out there, and they had a lot of them stolen. Yeah. So there's like a multi-tiered level of resiliency required and support typically, where people will go and steal generators, and they have to put armed, guards and things out there.
Yeah, but they didn't have their wife yelling at them, "Why is the tire flat? Why can't you move the generator?" So.
Pierre.
I was very struck by the commonality in language between the conversation about data collection with the conversations we've been having in the Spectrum group about enforcement and wireless interference. And it wasn't only resonance in the engineering conversation, but also in terms of the data analytics capability that the FCC has and how one does harmful interference enforcement in future. So the question is, and it may be a question for Russ and Dale and John Chapin, is this more than just a common set of words between the network outage and the wireless interference outage?
I don't think that demands an answer, but
yeah, that's kind of a deeper question. It's a good conversation. I think we should follow on. The one thing I do see, though, that becomes critical and a common theme across all these is collecting the right data and analyzing that data, which I don't think is being done today. And that's where I've seen, a thread across a few of these working groups.
Greg.
Even though I'm a member of this group, this is a question that didn't come up to me before now. Actually, at lunch today, we were discussing this, and a lot of us have an affinity for line powering. We like it. And we were just wondering, I'll ask Nomi this, because I know you're in that industry. Does the copper cable industry ever use line powering?
Yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes, but not pervasively. The one MSO that does that pretty broadly is Cox. Right, Therese would say the same thing, just because they were really early. They were really early in, and Dick Green's here, right? Because he remembers this too. Where's Dick Green? Is he still here?
He left.
He left. Okay. Anyhow, he would remember this too. They were early. They launched voice early, and they really felt like that was kind of table stakes in launching voice. At that time, it probably was, but now, as Russ mentioned, what we have is and every MSO is probably different, but we have pretty deep monitoring of our power supplies, and then standby power and monitoring of our standby power supplies. So we probably that's what we do instead. I don't know if that answered the question.
No, that was good. Thank you.
Good. Jack?
Real quick. When you guys talked about reporting, was it solely focused on during events, or reporting as a steady state sort of between providers?
That's a good clarification question, because we really talked about two kinds of reporting, namely one during catastrophic large-scale outages. That's almost more about situational awareness as opposed to why did it happen. You really don't care as much. Was it a tree or was it something else breaking connectivity? But there's also an ongoing monitoring of smaller reliability issues, because our perception, but again, not backed by real data, is that there's probably for many people on a day-to-day basis, it's more kind of a localized outages because a pole gets hit by a truck, that type of thing. And we don't have really any good data, because we only track the big ones, as to how common that is, how long these outages last, who is affected, and why do they occur. Providers presumably do, but that's not widely shared for obvious reasons. So yes, we're looking at both. The needs for monitoring and the instruments you would use would differ somewhat between the two.
Without getting into too much detail, I think it'd be good to consider having a good baseline, even in steady state, is incredibly important for situational awareness. So, as you guys think.
I'll make a brief plug that there is standardization work going on that I've been somewhat associated with on what's called the LMAP working group with Internet Engineering Task Force, where monitoring of a large number of parameters becomes not something you add on; it's literally built in. That allows you to do that on a routine basis, which we can't really do today. And I think that's a general goal that we want to, that monitoring of all kinds of parameters is something that you think about at the system design time, not something you add on later, because it just becomes too costly.
Good. And with that, we will move to our cleanup batter, Paul Steinberg.
Is there anybody on base still, Dennis?
You've got them loaded. Look around.
It's a dangerous situation. So we'll talk a little bit about the infrastructure security. So just quickly rescope from the previous discussion. The infrastructure security is a very large topic, and with the help of Ahmed and Gregory and Tosha from the FCC, we narrowed the scope up of this around specifically cloud-based security. And even though the statistics would show that the majority of computing is still done on dedicated private infrastructure, obviously we all know that it's a rapid transformation heading in the cloud direction. So this becomes increasingly important. If you recall back, we had 5 basic key objectives. And I would say in the last 3 months or so, we've really been tackling the first 4, which maybe simply put, to go back to something Brian said earlier, trying to get pretty smart in this subject. So we've conducted a lot of interviews and casual discussions, no surveys for the purposes of paperwork reduction. We were warned against that. And I learned an awful lot about a lot of things I didn't know before, which is very interesting. So Adam and I actually have chaired this, kind of managing between respective schedules. As I mentioned before, thanks to Greg and Ahmed for their FCC guidance and direction here as our liaisons, and then the members that have actually led and a lot of the work that's been done here. So going back, we had kind of a 3-stage approach. What we did was we sort of broke this problem into 3 chunks, and I think that served us okay. There were 3. The basic idea around consumer and enterprise cloud usage, one around critical infrastructure, things like public safety, utilities, those sorts of things, and then finally the network access, all those pieces being part of a viable cloud infrastructure service. And what we focused the last 3 months is what we call gap analysis, which was, as I mentioned before, the discussion with a variety of folks in industry. We kind of divided ourselves up along the lines of these 3 groups and then tried to get a sense of where are the gaps or maybe where are the potential opportunities around this space. So in a nutshell, Work Group 1 was chaired by Joe Wetzel, and who's going to give a couple of slides and a few slides down the road here as a report out of what Work Group 1 has actually found around this notion of how does the consumer in the enterprise domain think about potential security issues with cloud. Work Group 2 was chaired by George Popovich from Motorola, a couple rows behind Ed and Jesse there. And in the interest of time, I'll probably go ahead and just zip through those slides for us. And then Work Group 3 was actually led by Harold and Mike, with the able-bodied assistance of Mike McNamara. Neither of those folks are able to be here, so Romani is going to actually give us a few slides on what Work Group 3 has come up with. As I mentioned before, the majority of the work has been in the sense of analysis and discussion with industry experts. There is an awful lot in the industry going on around the subject of cloud security. If you just had a chance to peruse the backup slides, there's a first pass categorization of all the ecosystem providers, whether it's standards groups, government bodies, private groups that have an oar in the water relative to this notion of cloud security. So I would say tentatively the outputs that we've come up with to date, we've certainly ascertained some common themes and issues. It's hard for me to say, or hard for us to say right now, that there are bona fide gaps that we can actually point to and suggest that the FCC go off and try to close the gaps. There were certainly, across the 3 groups we interviewed, a very consistent and common set of concerns that were expressed. And I think that what you'll see in the end is that's what we're going to organize ourselves around for the last 3 months in terms of exploring what can be done to mitigate those concerns to increase the adoption of cloud-based services. Along the way, we developed a white paper. It's an intermediate result where we documented the key use cases and the potential gaps or issues associated with cloud security along each of the 3 groups that I spoke of. And then finally, what you'll see at the end of the report, out of the extraction of across all 3 work groups, interestingly enough, some common themes did materialize across all 3. So that's what looked to us to be the low-hanging fruit or the areas of greatest opportunity going forward. So what I'm going to do now, Joe, I'll just go ahead and advance the slides, but I'll turn it to Joe to kind of run us through Work Group 1's findings around consumer and enterprise cloud security.
Great. I'll go quickly. As Paul mentioned, our approach is basically to understand the total security context. It's not just about moving something to the cloud. When an enterprise moves something to the cloud, it's about access controls, in a distributed way. It's about the network. It's about the data. It's the whole piece that has to come together. And cloud plays various roles in that moving an application within an enterprise. So talked to lots of folks about that sort of problem, formed some hypotheses regarding the gaps. And you'll see at our next meeting we'll have some firm recommendations to talk through in terms of how to address those gaps. Go to the next slide. Okay, and we've got a couple different enterprise use cases. I won't read all the words, but typical kinds of things that happen in enterprise IT groups, and then a relatively pedestrian consumer application. The one thing that became, I think, apparent to us in talking with some providers and infrastructure companies was related to a very mature IT organization already has a pretty good staff, and they have a lot of the security portions of the solution under control. When you get to smaller businesses that either have one or two or three or no IT people, and they talk about moving things to the cloud and then kind of thinking about that being their secure solution, they don't have all the pieces of a security solution really sort of penciled together, and there is limited support for actually auditing how secure the app is itself. So you can have the best security in the cloud, but if you have a leaky app, it really is a problem. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we've talked to lots of folks, and the observations, like I just said, mature IT organizations are better equipped to understand their risks and deployment decisions. Smaller shops are where I think there's a fair amount of risk and a fair amount of opportunity, but it has to be understood in terms of the total context of what security means. Oftentimes, there could also be a small shop who needs to become PCI compliant, and they go to a provider who says, yes, we're PCI compliant, but if you look at the total PCI context, there's a lot more to it than moving it to a provider that says they have some PCI compliance components. And so therefore the language around security is not uniformly understood and used, which is a problem. And then, as I mentioned before, all the pieces need to come together. So in terms of preliminary gaps, one that really wasn't part of our charge at the beginning was to think about how good the app is and what kind of audit environment, audit tools really need to be deployed for the app itself before moving it to the cloud. Clear accountability for security functions, which are part of the cloud providers' accountability, which are still part of the user organization's IT function. And then what kind of audits could we think about for cloud providers in enough uniform detail and depth to be useful? Because if you ask a small IT shop, well, can you show us your entire security model, and can you show us what measures you have in place to measure all the component providers? They don't really even have an ability to deal with that, and not every small IT shop can afford to hire consultants to take care of that for them. So you need common language and some clear definitions within audits with actual metrics to be able to provide them the information they need in a quick fashion. So that's it for.
Okay. So group two, again, that was critical infrastructure. You can see in the upper left, I won't read the words, but copious scan across experts and industry forums. And then you get a sense at the lower left, some of the groups that were spoken with. There were some similar threads here from a different point of view. I mean, again, there's a big difference between what large governmental entities can actually accomplish versus the smaller entities, smaller municipalities, smaller agencies, and/or smaller like police forces and fire departments. And one observation is, even though the concern is around security, I think many of these we think many of these smaller folks would actually benefit from movement to the cloud, because I think a lot of their own techniques are sort of lax and falling behind. So even though there's this fear of the unknown, and clearly one of the common threads that Joe touched upon is education. How do they embrace the cloud? How do they move to the cloud? And then how do they know what they're doing? Public safety in particular moves very slowly and cautiously. There's a good reason for that. I mean, a lot of their data tends to find its way in the wrong places at the wrong time, and it can be embarrassing. They have some very serious constraints that they have to adhere to. One of the key things that's actually going on in industry is a program on the federal side called FedRAMP, which I think is run by the DHS. And it's really driving toward a standard way to certify cloud providers for federal use. So one of the key things is there something about FedRAMP that can be cascaded to states and locals so that best practices can actually propagate through at least the government side of the equation. Two interesting points to highlight on this slide. If you look down near the bottom, in Europe, clouds are already considered to be critical infrastructure, quote-unquote private clouds or industry-provided clouds. They're already tagged as critical infrastructure providing entities. And as I mentioned before, public safety is very concerned about the physical location privacy of the data that they actually have. So that leads to, this rough cadre or cast of folks here that are the players in the equation. And a note to self, as Russ was going through his slides, we clearly need more photographs and graphics in our next presentation. So we'll endeavor to shoot a little bit higher here. But as you can see here, there's the mission critical cases on the left. And they do raise the bar a bit, I would say, back to the discussion around industry or infrastructure resiliency. I agree with Russ. I think we've kind of gotten to the point now where the intersection's becoming pretty obvious, especially around CI. And then other forms of critical infrastructure around utilities and then municipalities. An interesting one that came up was this notion of single user experience, which is this idea about if you look inside of a reasonable sized municipality, the actual consumer experience for their water bill, their sewage bill, their various bills from that municipality, there's no convergence or consistency there. So this provides an opportunity for the municipalities to kind of clean up their act, if you will, in many respects. So similar to what Joe had identified, the key, there are several potential gaps that continue to resurface. But again, the ones that we're going to focus on that seem to have the greatest leverage are around this very basic notion of education. And that may be a case where a cascade of FedRAMP could actually help here. Identity and access management turned out to be a big deal here. I think most of the focus has been around authentication versus authorization. And if you think about that, a single user may need access to multiple discrete pieces of data that may reside in different clouds. So federating their access criteria so that they can achieve access to all the data they need to achieve their use case is one trick that we have to deal with. And then finally, this notion of attribute sharing and management of sharing of attributes between clouds, something to look at that is particularly unique to this area. So that's kind of what we'll be focusing on here, but as you can start to see, there's some common themes that emerge between the critical infrastructure private side and the public side that Joe talked through. So now we'll go to the network access piece, which is how do you get to and from a cloud, and I'll turn to Romani to take us through a little bit of that.
Thank you.
Oops, sorry.
So Paul mentioned the work was done by Harold and Mike, so I'm proxying for them. Okay. Similar to other groups, we also had group discussions with many players across the industry, like network and security vendors, manufacturers, and cloud providers, managed service providers, and network access providers. And of course, industry groups, like I could name CSA as an example, who are leading in this cloud security space. And we have one or two more we are lining up, but essentially trying to get a cross-section of the industry, what their experiences and insights are before we work on any possible recommendations. So the access methods, of course, range over internet access, over the top, VPN, dedicated access, and the observations. These are, again, very strikingly similar to some of the things which are reported by the other working groups. The driver for, obviously, the momentum for adoption for the cloud is economic benefit by using shared resources. And, of course, with the decreasing cost of compute and storage, this becomes more and more attractive. Another point is always the agility, time to market, how quickly I can spin up elastic capacity we can get. That's become pretty attractive. So these are the drivers, but based on these interviews, there seems to be a wide range of expertise, just like Joe was mentioning, all the way from people who are very savvy in all the security and protection at the other end, say, we will give it to the cloud provider. They should know more than I know for the security. So that does range across the whole spectrum there. Of course, the many of the cloud service providers will want to maximize the return on investment. So the aspect of additional security is more like an add-on option, a premium service, not necessarily required. So this means the consumer has to have access to information or his own knowledge to even understand what kind of he's getting into. So there are several, the NIST calls the various actors like cloud providers, cloud consumers, cloud carriers, cloud brokers. There's a lot of actors. It's a big ecosystem. So everybody has got a role to play, but I don't believe there is some standard method of performance appraisal or anything of the offerings. So the general feeling also was that it is like it's an end-to-end process. The security is as strong as the weakest link in the chain. That seems to come through many of these interviews. So in terms of gaps and concerns, these are some of the things we heard. Now, during the next 3 months, we'll drill down and vet these things, or really is anecdotal gaps or really systemic gaps that we should address. Okay. So who has the end-to-end accountability? We talked about the ecosystem, multiple actors, but at the end of the day, either someone who has or who should have end-to-end accountability for this application data and everything. Are there any common standards for measuring performance of the cloud service providers or the various cloud actors? Of course, there's a lot of network threads, BGP, DNA redirects, but these are not new ones. They've been there before. A lot of mitigation strategies have been done. IETF has done a lot of on the BGP area, how to make it more robust and all that. But nevertheless, there's an area that was mentioned we should be looking at. Is anything else new to be done or not? One other comment we heard was that the desirability for the consumers to know, visibility for the consumer to know who is accessing the data, what is happening to his data when he entrusts that to the cloud. Another area could be that known vulnerabilities, how fast we can make this information available to everybody else so that everybody can have some mitigation strategies as well as any proactive monitoring tools, making it available, the information available to the whole industry. We heard some comments, we still not solved the investigation. Don't tell me what's wrong, apparently some CEO's perception. Don't tell me what's wrong. I may have to act on it. So this is it because no resources or so this is an area, it's a little bit of a controversial anecdotal statement. We need to look into that. Okay. So some of the things like a CSA has got the cloud control matrix, 100 items are there. There's all best practices and everything. You need to encourage, perhaps one of the action could be not only education, but disseminating information about this availability of work that has been done by the NIST and CSA and other things. One of the big items also, evolving technologies. So software-defined networking, network function virtualization. These are going to bring a little bit new dimension to the whole area of security, protection, and everything. Some people feel it's almost there if you ask the Open Networking Foundation, the SDNS today, but if you ask them incumbents, it's not going to be there for a while. But the network function virtualization also is another area. They are complementary but not the same. But these are new evolving technologies that could impact the whole area of access and cloud security. So this is an area we would like to dwell a little bit more into in the next 3 months or so. So that's where we are. There are obviously common themes which I talked about, Joe's and Working Group 2. That's what probably Paul will address, so closing up this one.
So the last slide, if I could have it back, just what we've netted out of all that, the gaps or the common themes that we picked up around security, this notion of accountability. It's a complicated world, all the way from an application to the access to the actual cloud provider. And the interesting thing about the accountability, who actually owns the end-to-end security, it varies as a function of how the cloud services are being consumed. If cloud is being consumed as infrastructure, most of the responsibility lies with the consumer. If you move up the stack and the cloud services are being consumed as software, then the responsibility or more of the accountability must rest with the provider of the service. So there's no one answer that actually fits all here, and that's where I think a lot of the educational pieces will fit in. If you move to the education part, this is a case where we may be able to, I think that the gap to close here is really around the have-nots, if you will, or the people that are struggling to come up the curve. I think the larger entities have staffs, have capability to actually form their own, in many cases actually build their own clouds and make the decisions about public and private. It's the small to medium entities, whether they're government, municipalities, or enterprises, that actually need help here. That message came through repeatedly. How do I even know if my cloud service provider meets the security factors that I need? How do I go about developing a service level agreement? So those kinds of facts, I think, are something that you'll start to see come out of us. Taking a page from last year's mobile device security group, industry collaboration was one key theme. There's a whole lot going on in the industry, but once again, you have the situation where you have competitors finding it difficult to actually collaborate on common issues. This is a role where an entity like the FCC could actually bridge. We talked a little bit last year about clean rooms or common environments where, a threat-free kind of a place where entities can collaborate without fear of being considered collusive. Certification, this notion about how's a cloud service provider actually quantified? How do I know what I'm getting? How do I know what service level agreement they're providing? This is a case where FedRAMP, I think, is actually providing a good direction to pursue, specifically in the context of federal government agencies in terms of certification of cloud service providers for their use. And then finally, auditing. How once a service provider or a cloud entity is certified at a certain level, how do you make sure that they actually maintain that level? So as I said before, it remains to be seen if there are bona fide, honest-to-goodness gaps that have to be filled, if it's a matter of let the industry actually continue to progress and it will close these holes, and then, of course, what the role the FCC can actually play here. But for sure, we can certainly provide an accounting of all the industry entities that are involved in each of these potential gaps or issues and develop some recommendations where the FCC can begin to play an active role to try to bridge this gap as the world moves toward cloud-based computing. And I'll end there.
That was terrific, impressive in getting through in a timely manner as well as conveying a great deal of information.
Actually, my goal was to take 5 more minutes to make sure there were no questions, but
you didn't quite succeed.
Just one question. So, sorry, let me just make sure that's at human height. When you guys took a look at what are the exposures or vulnerabilities with moving applications to the cloud, one of I think the biggest differences between on-premise based deployment is that you have a shift from east-west traffic to north-south, and so you have a new vulnerability on what your access to the cloud looks like, namely whatever that private line is if you're a business, et cetera. Have you taken a look at, how does that impact the end-to-end availability now of your applications, because it's now much more dependent on your connectivity to the cloud?
Yeah, so that was the point of the access piece. So obviously, one simple answer is the security is ultimately the responsibility of the application, but that doesn't work.
Right.
The security is the responsibility of the cloud service provider. That doesn't work either. So absolutely, that's why the access piece came into the equation. And I think the gap that we see, honestly, is around that issue of accountability, because it's really difficult to put your finger on one entity that's actually going to adhere to the responsibility. Now, I'm not sure if you were pulling on this or not, but when you talked about east-west, there's an east-west component to this as well, and I was trying to allude to that earlier, where a given user or given application may have to touch multiple clouds in order to actually accomplish what its objective or mission is. And so now you create that issue where, again, the strongest point is equal to the weakest link in that entire equation.
Right.
Yeah, Andy.
So, as my cloud providers clearly have tried to provide like availability zones for one of the large cloud providers to deal with whole data center outages, has your group been able to identify statistics on what the effective reliability is of the major cloud providers? I haven't seen that published anywhere.
So we haven't tried, to be honest with you. I think that is the intersection with the rest of this group.
And the other question I wonder about is in certain industries, I know in the payment industry, for example, there are requirements on providers, on merchant providers that accept credit card data to be certified largely by self-certification plus automated means, known as, in the payment industry, PCI DSS in particular. I wonder if your group has thought about as to whether these type of mechanisms, which are relatively low cost, I have gone through that mechanisms, I'm somewhat familiar with it. It is something which is at least imposed upon small entities as well as large entities, as to whether similar type of semi-automated mechanisms could deal with some of both cloud and application security, at least the 80%, the obvious stuff that people will scan for, the vulnerabilities which are well known, as opposed to kind of the APT type of threats.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that, I mean, the exact example you gave is a good example of an application-specific service taking control of managing the whole end-to-end security issue, the banking community.
Actually, for the PCI DSS, what they do is they scan your your internet-facing infrastructure, and they generally scan for vulnerabilities that are independent of the fact that you accept credit cards, just that those vulnerabilities are more likely to make it easier for malicious third parties to get access to your database, to your web server, and so on.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, that's definitely in play. Back to your first question, the metrics, is that something the FCC would find desirable to actually have? Metrics of cloud availability and reliability?
I don't know if there's an official opinion on that. I would imagine that our particular concern would be, as the group report alluded to, as NG911 is starting to no longer host equipment on the PSAP, which has been the traditional model where every PSAP had like a small data center with its own set of management as well as resilience problems. There's much more now of a movement towards hosting the NG911 infrastructure, servers and so on, in either dedicated government type of clouds or even commercial cloud, and clearly we would be concerned if that had a significant impact on overall 911 reliability. I really don't want to have the whole 911 system in the United States have a lights out moment when Amazon has a hiccup. That's probably not a good way to design it. Right now we have no idea what the shared infrastructure, for example, is, because these are often provided by commercial providers, not the PSAPs themselves or not the state government or the local government, but by third-party service providers. And we have really very little notion as to whether there are common vulnerabilities in terms of physical vulnerabilities, common shared single points of failure at whatever layer of architecture.
Okay.
Russ?
So have you thought about trying to drive this through more of the standards process? You made some comments about regulations, metrics, and certifications. Are you at all concerned about imposing those and driving just the clouds outside the U.S. then?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of issues there. I mean, if you look at the list, there's standards groups, there are industry consortia, the Cloud Security Alliance being one that actually promote the whole thing. So I think probably driving this through standards, we're probably not going to get that far, to be honest with you, Russ. But I think pointing the FCC at the best places to get leverage across the different groups is probably the most low-hanging fruit we're going to get to here.
All right, excellent. Oh, Shahid, you had one last?
If I could just squeeze in one last question.
Remembering that it's the 4 o'clock hour.
Yes, and we'll get a yes or no answer on this, so feel free to do that. Question, is there a consumer awareness angle to this from a perspective that, hey, I've got a garage opener app on my iPhone, and where's that data? Is it somewhere in the cloud, obviously, but is there an education, consumer awareness perspective around this whole concept of cloud?
Maybe.
I like that. Thank you very much.
Good, solid answer.
I think most people just hit I agree and go forward.
I guess
David.
my philosophy on that is most consumers don't really know or want to care whether data is in a cloud or whether it's someplace else. So educating them, other than just the usual practices of how to manage their data, is probably the best we're going to do, I would think, on that front.
David?
Well, I think, in the interim report, we identified the very, very large number of organizations that are involved in sort of standards, regulations, et cetera, and including a large number of government organizations involved in different aspects of cloud infrastructure. And I think it would be beneficial if we were able to focus this activity more on the sorts of issues, for example, that Henning identified, where there's a clear, sort of FCC interest because there the cloud is being used to support an FCC-related function. I think it gets a little bit cloudier, let's say, when we start kind of delving into the broad uses of the cloud. We start commenting on areas that, to be honest, a lot of other groups that are much better informed than we are and have much more expertise in the space than we do are already studying. So I'd like to sound that caution. I've sounded it within the group. I'd like to sound it broadly, because I think that one of the things that we risk doing, first off, is making ill-informed judgments, and I think that's not in our interest or in the interest of the FCC's. I think we also risk sort of kind of putting the FCC in a position where it's perhaps duplicating or triplicating or quadruplicating the work of other agencies that are better informed. I think I'll stop there. It could be a laundry list, but the largest concern I have here is, in the case even, Henning, of some of those organizations that you mentioned, you have to wonder, when Amazon has a hiccup, it gets, and they're a competitor, but I'll defend them here. When they have a hiccup, it may get a lot of attention, but it's a relatively rare event. And I would say that, if we integrated the total amount of outage over their hiccups versus the outages that would have happened if you had all of these relatively small organizations that are much less equipped, have much less redundancy, much less robustness, you'd probably find that the overall outage level would be a lot higher. And I'm pretty sure if we did the arithmetic, we'd probably figure that out pretty quickly. So what I'm concerned about is that if we're not careful and we sound an alarm that's not carefully thought through, we're going to find we're going to slow people down moving from something that is poorer to something that is better. Now, just because it's, we all want the better thing to be even better yet and as good as it possibly can be. But I would hate to see the public at large stuck with a relatively poor solutions when there are better solutions out there because we discourage them from moving.
All right. I'm not sure that was the high point of the meeting to end on, but well spoken, David. I will attempt to create a high point at the end, and by causing us all to look back on where we've been through the course of the last 3 hours. We have covered a really impressive breadth of territory and covered in considerable depth, and that really is kudos to our speakers, to Paul and to Russ and to Lynn and to Brian and to Shahid. So thank you all, and thanks to as you've already recognized, the FCC liaisons who have been so supportive of the groups. And thank you to each one of you as members of the various groups. Some of you have even duplicated on multiple groups, but it's a lot of work that is very much in evidence as we've had the opportunity to review it today. I do want to flash up the slides, if we could get, there we go. What we've attempted to capture, and we didn't take it. We didn't take into account the captioning.
These were done in real time.
Yeah, the real time, because what we attempted to do, and I'm going to send this out first to the speakers. We attempted to capture if you will, the headlines. Julie gave me that as a term to use, but to try to describe to ourselves what it is that we have as headlines, as key actionable items in Tom's previous focus, but some of them are actionable at different levels. But we'll send these out. There are 3 pages of them, and as Walter said, done in real time, so different fonts and so on. But I think we'll try to get these out first to the speakers as representatives of the work groups, and then to everyone after you've vetted them, to make sure we all understand the bottom line after the 3 hours of discussion on so many details. So that would be a goal for us coming out. The next item I would just remind you all on is that you've laid out a large amount of activity that is going to be completed in early December. So I'm really looking forward to that as we have our year end. We're building up to that year end. The anticipation has grown for all of us, and hopefully we can accomplish all of the things that were set forth in the presentations today. But you've already accomplished a lot, and so I do appreciate that. As I say that, on top of all of the other work, we do have our annual year-end look at next year. So as you get closer to the end of the year and starting now, start thinking about the activities that need to be pursued next year. Some of them will be directly related to what perhaps wasn't done this year that this year caused you to identify as something that needs to be done in the future. Others will be brand new items. Our industry is always on the move, and the opportunity to identify hot areas that need to be considered is always before us. So if you would put that into your work list as well, that would be greatly appreciated. And with that, I will let Julie give us any final comments from his side, followed by Walter, who always keeps us in order. Julie?
Can I go after Walter? No, just want to reiterate, thanks to all of you for all the work that has gone in. It's been a 3-hour meeting, but it's also, I know you're putting in a lot more time aside from the meetings, and I can assure you see the representation from the commission staff here. These ideas really are things that we listen to closely, and as in the past, we're looking for things that we can actually move forward on. So, this work that you're doing is important to the commission, and I think is going to lead to more things for us to do.
And just a quick thanks to Dennis. He stepped in when we had a gap in our leadership. Very generous in his time, and a commission, we're just very thankful to have him here.
Yeah.
That was not the final comment from you that I was expecting, but much appreciated. With that, thank you one and all. We'll look forward to talking with you and seeing you all in December. Take care.